The subject matter, statements by members, déclaration de député, honorable député de Joliette.
Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, last Monday, after decades of work, an historic agreement was reached between the Atikamekw Nation and the Government of Quebec. Manawan and Wemotashi will become the first Indigenous communities in Quebec to establish their own youth protection services. By replacing the provincial authority, this network will allow at-risk youth to remain within their communities. Youth will be accompanied by trusted workers who will respect their culture, and they will do so in a more familiar context. Our party has always encouraged a nation-to-nation relationship, and this initiative is a perfect example of that. By respecting our respective traditions and realities, we can build a common future. Whether we're talking about education, public safety, or youth protection, Aboriginal communities are best placed to understand the public services that they need. Let's hope that this agreement will be the first of many of its kind.
Full member for Niagara Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to the late May O'Sullivan. May left us in December of last year after 98 wonderful years. A dedicated mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, May was an inspiration to all that knew her. My thoughts and prayers are with May's children, her 14 grandchildren, and 13 great-grandchildren. May, Mr. Speaker, was a pillar of the Niagara Centre community, particularly in the city of Thorold. She was a member of Our Lady of Holy Rosary Church for more than 75 years and a dedicated political volunteer for nearly 80 years. She had a zest for life with no other, Mr. Speaker, and always succeeded with grit and determination, always with a smile on her face. Many in my community were blessed to have May as a mentor over her many, many years. Mr. Speaker, ever the voice of reason, when May spoke, everyone stopped and listened. Our community is better for May's lifetime contribution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Mr. Speaker, on January 11th, the Coast Guard escorted ships on the St. Clair River, and the resulting push on the ice destroyed the Blue Water Ferry border crossing between Sombra, Ontario, and Marine City, Michigan. I immediately raised this urgent issue to the Ministers of Transportation, Infrastructure, Public Safety, and Oceans and Fisheries, and when they couldn't find funding, I escalated it to the Prime Minister's office. Despite having a minister's retreat in London only days before and claiming to serve southwestern Ontario, they have yet to bring aid to reopen this vital border crossing. The Liberals found $2.5 million to keep the ice rink on Parliament Hill open another month, but they could not find that same amount for this emergency. Liberal inaction means that the border will now be closed for 8 months or permanently, killing businesses on both sides of the border. Mr. Speaker, today I call upon the Prime Minister to do the right thing and to restore the ferry border crossing at Sombra.
L'honorable député de Longueuil.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Charlemagne. Mr. Speaker, I recently had the chance to visit my colleagues' riding of Lac St. Louis and to visit the Montreal area facilities of MDA, a proudly Canadian company that employs people nationwide.
MDA is helping develop the satellites for the Canadian Space Agency's RadarSat constellation, which will be launched later this year. Satellite imagery from the constellation will serve the search and rescue operations of the Royal Canadian Air Force.
MDA should be proud of its technology, which is used to improve emergency response times, to better determine response zones, and to reduce the risk of injury to first responders. Mr. Speaker, so I'd like to rise to congratulate MDA for its essential contribution to the Canada Space Agency. Thank you.
Honourable member for Vancouver East.
February is Black History Month. It allows us to celebrate a diverse Black Canadian community whose heritage traces back to the U.S., the Caribbean, and the African continent. In Vancouver East, there was a vibrant community of Black Canadians known as Hogan's Alley. While the strength of this community has never diminished, the community no longer has a geographical center. It was destroyed to construct the viaduct in 1972, which is now slated to come down. We need to learn from this history. What we built in this place needs to honor the contributions of the Black community by ensuring vulnerable populations are housed. Many of Canada's Black community's contributions are not recognized in our history. Black History Month gives Canadians an opportunity to hear this history and to highlight the struggles the Black community continues to address in the fight against prejudice, discrimination, and inequality. Black Lives Matter. With love and courage, let us continue our efforts to build a more just, equal, and inclusive Canada.
The honourable member for Fundy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, I had the honour of presenting Canada 150 Community Leader Awards to 20 Fundy Royal constituents in December. These awards showcased individuals who are not only recognized for their work, those who continue day in and day out to work for those that are less fortunate, to welcome newcomers to our communities, to preserve and safeguard our environment, and those who help us recognize and reconcile with our past. To Daryl Tozer, Scott Costain, John Whitmore, Barry Wanamaker, Andrew Fry, Ida McPherson, Yenna Hurley, Austin Henderson, Zach Vogel, Sarah Aerosmith, Linda Carey, Dustine Rodier, Joan Routledge, Chrisma Williamson, Ben Whalen, Eric Cunningham, Beverly Franklin, Judy LeBlanc, Miranda Van Geest, and Phyllis Sutherland, I want to say thank you for your service and commitment to our communities. In 2018, let us reflect on how fortunate we are to call this beautiful country home, and remember that being Canadian means supporting each other and opening our hearts to those who need it the most.
The honourable member for North Okanagan-Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Excitement is building across the North Okanagan-Shuswap as Vernon's 58th annual Winter Carnival opens and runs through February 11th. This year, Western Canada's biggest Winter Carnival theme is Carnival in Wonderland. Expect to see more than Alice, the Mad Hatter, and the Queen of Hearts at dozens of events around Vernon for the next 10 days. You may even run into Joe Poe and Joe Pett, the Carnival's mime ambassadors. Tonight, a new Queen Silver Star will be crowned, and Saturday, the big marquee parade winds its way through downtown Vernon. Silver Star Mountain will host the Over the Hill Downhill event and a world-class snow sculpture contest. There will be events for everyone, including pancake breakfast, sporting events, dinner theatre, and pub nights, even a grandparent-grandchild dance. But watch out for the Carnival cops, because they've been known to nab anyone from politicians to hockey players and lock them up for not wearing their Carnival buttons. I thank all of the Carnival volunteers and sponsors. Without them, this Winter Wonderland Festival would not be possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Surrey Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it's wonderful to be back in the nation's capital, but I'm also grateful for the time I spent in my riding Surrey Centre. Over the holiday season, I hosted many events, but one of my most favorite events was to host a new Canadian citizen party in the most Canadian way possible on an ice rink. During the event, I had the opportunity to speak to many of them. I learned about their diverse backgrounds, how they continue to define what it is to be Canadian. Since October 2015, Surrey Centre has welcomed over 2,000 new citizens. I am excited to see contributions they will continue to make in our schools, business, and industry in Canada. I want to thank all the new citizens for choosing Surrey Centre as their home, and I want to tell them all, I am here for you. Thank you.
Honourable member for South Surrey White Rock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the people of South Surrey White Rock for the confidence that they have shown in me and the support that they have given to me. Their consistent passion for our community and our country reminds me clearly of what it means to be Canadian. As I take my seat in this House, I would also thank my elected colleagues on both sides of this House and at local and provincial governments across this great country. You give your energy, effort, and thought to provide perspectives that help us all to better understand what it means to live in relative harmony and in a proudly multicultural and pluralistic country. We are tolerant and uniquely accepting, and our job as elected representatives is not easy. In 1946, Albert Einstein was asked, why is it that when the mind of man has stretched so far as to discover the structure of the atom, that we've been unable to devise the political means to keep the atom from destroying us? And Albert Einstein responded, that is simple, my friend. It is because politics is much more difficult than physics. And Mr. Speaker, I've sadly always found physics to be most difficult. Please be tolerant. Thank you, kind Speaker.
Honourable member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Mr. Speaker, rural crime in Alberta is on the rise, and our Alberta Conservative Caucus initiated the Alberta Rural Crime Task Force. My colleagues and I held many meetings, roundtables, and public forums to hear community concerns. Many constituents expressed gratitude to the RCMP for doing an amazing job. But the justice system keeps putting career criminals back on the street to continue their illegal activities. While the majority of crimes we see are classic break and entering, we are now seeing such more violent rural crimes. There are stories about terrible beatings, hold-ups at gunpoint, and in some cases, victims are victimized by the same criminal over and over. I heard stories of witnesses' intimidation and the fear of reporting a crime because they know criminals will get virtually no jail time and will be back to continue their harassment. It's time the government takes a strong stance on ensuring career criminals are kept off our streets.
Honourable member for Whitby.
Mr. Speaker, as we launch Black History Month, I'd like to draw to the attention of the House a remarkable piece of literature by Robin Maynard entitled Policing Black Lives. This book chronicles the experience of Black people in Canada in a raw, exposed, and truthful place. It documents the slavery of Black people in Canada, the harsh economic and social realities that we face post-slavery, and the institutional and systemic practices and policies that continue to undermine us today. Mr. Speaker, because the experiences of Black Canadians is seen to be not as bad as the United States does not make it okay. In fact, it is this notion that has led to the generalized erasure of the Black experience in education and the Canadian proclivity for ignoring racial disparities. I invite everyone in this chamber and across the country to learn more about Black history in Canada, and this book will help you do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable member for Don Valley East.
Mr. Speaker, the first week of February, designated by the UN General Assembly as the World Interfaith Harmony Week, is celebrating its 8th year. In Toronto, the city gave a proclamation designating February 1st to 7th as WIHW Week. The WIHW Toronto's theme for 2018 is The Promise of Inclusion, where people of all faith groups of goodwill are coming together through dialogue, music, culture, and art to show the world that peace and harmony can exist irrespective of faith, culture, or creed. This is truly a reflection of what a cosmopolitan society should be, accepting differences and seeking to actively understand it. I encourage all Canadians to attend any of the WIHW events in their communities and to spread the message of love of the good and love of the neighbor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bravo. Honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to the life and legacy of the late Florence Kail. Florence was a woman of faith, love, and compassion. It was these characteristics that led her to found the Stratford House of Blessing in 1983 with the support and love of her husband, Norman. 3.5 decades later, the Stratford House of Blessing stands as a tribute to Florence and an institution of caring and compassion in our community, fulfilling its mandate of serving those who are hurting and in need. Florence was a recipient of multiple awards and commendations, including both the Queen's Golden and Diamond Jubilee Medals, the Ontario Medal for Good Citizenship, and Stratford Citizen of the Year. In speaking with members of Florence's family, they mentioned that she had a long list of good deeds that she wanted to accomplish in the year to come. It now falls to each of us in our community to fulfill those goals in memory and in honor of this remarkable woman. Mr. Speaker, through hard work and a kind heart, Florence Kail made this world a better place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa-Vanier. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to rise today in memory of the Honourable Member who held this seat before me.
Last night, I was honored to be present in the gallery as C-210, an act to amend the national anthem, was voted on by senators. After sitting in the other place for 19 months, including nearly a year at third reading, I was delighted to see senators finally adopt the act and send it for royal assent. Mr. Speaker, our anthem will very soon be gender neutral, promoting Canada's commitment to the equality of sexes and women's rights. Le dévouement de Mauril.
Mauril's commitment to having a gender-neutral anthem will be a legacy for future generations.
I'm very proud to stand here today and sing along with all of my honorable colleagues. In all of us command.
Order. As much as we all appreciate patriotism, I want to remind members that we're not here to sing or chant, except on Wednesdays, of course, when we sing the national anthem. We don't. It should be one person at a time. I know members understand that.
Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Loire. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to talk about the future of our planet. That is what brought together the citizens of Salaberry-sur-Loire on January 16th, as they tried to find new ways of starting a green shift. We hosted 3 renowned experts: Normand Mousseau, professor of physics at the University of Montreal, Lorraine Caron, director of the company Transitio, and Geneviève Aude-Puskas, popular science writer for Équiterre. They reminded us that the Canadian government committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. But their plan isn't based on any scientific data. So we need to have a green shift toward a better developed public transit, greener building standards, and a comprehensive plan that coordinates all federal departments. These measures will benefit the economy as much as the environment. It's time to ensure that we can keep our commitments for our future and for that of our children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, today begins Black History Month, where we celebrate in a particular way the historic and present contributions of Black Canadians. Canada has been richly blessed by these contributions. Many of the first Black Canadians came here to escape slavery. Upper Canada was the first jurisdiction in the British Empire to free slaves and legislate against slavery in 1793. In addition to our relatively early opposition to slavery, Canadians can take pride in the pivotal role we played in the fight against apartheid. But our relative success is not enough. Ongoing instances of racism continue to impact the lives of Black Canadians. Conservatives are eager to work with colleagues in other parties and civil society to fight racism. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to highlight the contributions of a few Black Canadians in particular. Lincoln Alexander was the first Black member of Parliament, then Cabinet Minister. He was also a Conservative. William Hall was the first Black Canadian sailor, as well as the first Black Canadian to receive the Victoria Cross. And Mary Ann Shadd was a well-known anti-slavery activist and the first woman publisher in North America. We applaud the past and continuing vital contributions of Canada's Black community.
The Honourable Member for Bourassa. Mr. Speaker, 23 years ago, the House of Commons recognized February as Black History Month. I think we should celebrate the differences that make Canada a strong, diverse, inclusive, and proud country. 2018's theme is Black Canadian Women, Stories of Strength, Courage, and Vision. Today, I have the privilege of paying tribute to one of those women. Her name is not in the history books. She was widowed at the age of 40 and raised her 8 children. She made huge sacrifices to educate her children. She gave up her studies and started to work as a seamstress so that she could pay the bills. She died in Montreal in 2003 and is buried in Saint-Marc. She was a paragon of strength, courage, vision, and love. Thank you to Elvire Adé-Dubourg, my beloved mother.
Oral questions, questions orales. L'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, a year ago, the Prime Minister attempted to cover up details of his vacations on the private island of a billionaire. Thanks to our leader who called for an investigation into those illegal vacations, we all know that the Prime Minister violated 4 sections of the Ethics and Conflict of Interests Act. Now, The Prime Minister should take responsibility and show Canadians that he follows the same rules as all members here. When will he pay Canadians back for the $215,000 for his illegal trip? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, immediately after the Commissioner's report was released, the Prime Minister took responsibility, accepted the findings, and committed to submitting further vacation plans to the Commissioner for approval in advance. The other side waited far longer. Now that the report's been released, the results, the findings and conclusions have been accepted. We'd like to thank the Commissioner for her recommendations, and we will follow all of them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of the week, we've been trying to get an answer from the Prime Minister, who doesn't want to answer in person. Meanwhile, the House Leader is like a broken record, saying the same lines over and over again as written by Liberal strategists. Can the House Leader put her lines aside and tell Canadians simply, will the Prime Minister pay back the $215,000 that he took out of their pockets? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, as I said many times, the Prime Minister has answered these questions many times over. We accept the Commissioner's findings and we respect her work. Every day, members of the opposition are asking and reading the same questions over and over, and they expect me not to read the same answers. It's a bit surprising. The Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, it's really funny what we're seeing here. The Leader is saying that we should conclude that the Prime Minister is above the law. The Prime Minister thinks that members here and ordinary Canadians have to follow the law, but the Prime Minister doesn't. I'd like to understand why, when ministers get caught red-handed, they have to reimburse. Why doesn't the Prime Minister have to do that? Why doesn't he have to pay back the $215,000 he took out of taxpayers' pockets? The Right Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we respect the work of officers of Parliament. Unlike the opposition, when officers of Parliament make recommendations, we take them seriously and we cooperate with them to make sure we follow their recommendations. In addition, the Prime Minister committed to submitting all future personal and family vacation plans in advance to the Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I've seen other Liberals, like the Indigenous Services Minister, as well as the member for Malpeque and the member from Humber River, Black Creek, pay back taxpayers for inappropriate expenses that they claimed. And you know what? That was the right thing to do. But the Prime Minister thinks that he doesn't have to pay back over $200,000 in illegal expenses that he paid. He thinks he's above the law and above the rules. Why does the Prime Minister think that there's one set of rules for him and another set of rules for everyone else?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
On numerous occasions, the Prime Minister and myself, many others, have reiterated that immediately following the report being submitted, that we accepted the recommendations, the Prime Minister took responsibility. What is clear is that the Conservatives continue to focus on the Prime Minister. They continue to focus on us, while we will continue to focus on Canadians. Last night, once again, the Prime Minister was at a public town hall. He was hearing directly from Canadians. They were talking about the very real challenges that they are facing, including immigration delays. While the Conservatives thought 24 months was adequate, we have reduced that to 12 months. We will continue getting...
Honourable Opposition House Leader.
We're focused on the Prime Minister because he is the only Prime Minister in the history of Canada to break the Conflict of Interest Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, recently the Prime Minister said that he believes the standard applied to others on the issue of sexual harassment applies to everyone, including himself, and that indeed is true, Mr. Speaker. But why is it that when it comes to paying back taxpayers' dollars that the Prime Minister clearly should not have used and that is owed back, he thinks he doesn't have to pay? Why does the Prime Minister think that the standard that is applied to everyone else in this place when it comes to paying illegal or improper expenses doesn't apply to him?
Honourable Government House Leader.
As has been the case for past Prime Ministers, and as is the case for this Prime Minister, whenever and wherever the Prime Minister travels, there are costs related to security. Once the Commissioner had submitted the report, the Prime Minister took responsibility, he accepted the recommendations. It's interesting because the opposition, for weeks, for months, for a year even, were asking for that report to be submitted. Now that it's submitted, they refuse to accept its findings. We respect the work of the Commissioner, we respect the work of officers of Parliament, and we thank them for their work. We will accept the recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-Basque. The Panama Papers scandal broke in 2016. And to date, in other countries, the taxman has managed to recover over $500 million from fraudsters identified in the Panama Papers. Spain alone has already recovered $122 million US. In Canada, we won't find out anything until 2020. When it's a small taxpayer, they bring out the big guns. But when it's a big fraudster, they get the kid glove treatment. The minister has a clear choice. When is she going to hold the agency accountable to Canadians? Mr. Speaker, tax evasion is a priority for this government. We are focused on those who are not complying with tax law abroad. 150 taxpayers linked with the Panama Papers have been identified and audited. The rules have been tightened up when it comes to voluntary disclosure. These individuals will have to face the full consequences, those who do not step up and voluntarily disclose. The honourable member for Rimouski-Nejet.
Incompetence. The Canada Revenue Agency moves at the snail's pace against fraudsters using offshore tax havens, while the U.S. heavily fines KPMG for facilitating tax evasion. The CRA here gives KPMG a slap on the wrist for the same offense. Half the calls the agency receives go unanswered, and 30% of the information given to the other half is actually wrong. Why is this government rewarding incompetence by giving their executive members $35,000 bonuses?
No, Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is resolved to fight tax evasion and avoidance. That's why we've earmarked unprecedented spending on the effort to fight these problems. Every year, the agency looks at 4 high-risk jurisdictions, the first 2 being the Isle of Man and Guernsey. As of December 31st, 2017, the agency had investigated over 1,000 taxpayers and brought prosecutions. The honourable member for Berthier-Masky-Nongé.
Canada Infrastructure Bank. The Liberals courted the most powerful investors on the planet, all behind closed doors. Companies like BlackRock only want one thing, Mr. Speaker, more money in their pockets. And guess what? The finance minister promised them that. An economist at the University of Ottawa, Randall Bartlett, called the scheme a subsidy by another name. Mr. Speaker, why do the Liberals keep helping their Bay Street friends and do absolutely nothing to help everyday Canadians get by?
Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, we're moving forward with our historic $180 billion infrastructure plan, which includes the establishment of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We are proud to have announced that Bruno Guglielmetti has been appointed as Chief Investment Officer and that Janice Fukakusa has been appointed as Chair of a highly qualified and diverse Board of Directors that will lead this important organization. Now operational, the bank is helping to build more infrastructure across Canada and create the strong, sustainable and inclusive communities Canadians want to live in.
A member for Berthier-Masky-Nongé.
Mr. Speaker, 2 years after the announcement, the Liberals still don't want to come clean on the infrastructure bank. What we do know is that the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have held a number of private meetings to court investment giants like BlackRock. What we also know is that these companies want to invest in Canada because the bank will allow for lower risk and bigger profits through user fees. Will the Finance Minister finally have the courage to tell the truth to Canadians? Who is truly going to benefit from this infrastructure bank? The Honourable Minister of Transport.
The Canada Infrastructure Bank will invest in infrastructure that is in the public interest, providing an innovative new infrastructure financing tool and attracting private sector investment to build transformational projects that may not otherwise get built. This is an optional tool that our provincial, territorial, Indigenous and municipal partners can use to increase the long-term affordability and sustainability of infrastructure in their communities.
Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister broke the law. He's been found to have violated 4 major sections of the Conflict of Interest Act, and in breaking the law, he wasted hundreds of thousands of Canadians' hard-earned tax dollars. He's offered no meaningful answers in the House, and he's refused a reasonable invitation to discuss the Ethics Commissioner's finding in the serene and respectful surroundings of the Ethics Committee. So why, at the very least, won't the Prime Minister simply repay Canadians for his illegal vacation?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
On numerous occasions. Immediately after the report was released, the Prime Minister took responsibility, accepted the findings of the Commissioner. The Prime Minister has taken steps to ensure that all future family vacations are cleared ahead of time. There's a process here. There was a concern. The Commissioner looked at it. The Commissioner offered a report. We have accepted the recommendations. The Prime Minister has accepted responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That's excellent. Serene. The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, even the British Prime Minister appears before a committee. But, Mr. Speaker, as the Liberal House Leader recites the Prime Minister's empty lines, the message is, case closed, nothing going on here. The PM promises to consult the Ethics Commissioner about future vacations. But there are other important findings in the Commissioner's report. For example, evidence of the PM's bizarre, unethical attitude regarding lobbying. He thinks he can break conflict and lobby laws because he's just relationship building. His interaction is ceremonial. When will the Prime Minister do the right thing?
Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and this government will continue to engage with Canadians and listen to the very real challenges that they are facing. When it comes to these questions, the Prime Minister has answered these questions. Since the new year, the Prime Minister has been available at numerous town halls, including last night in Winnipeg. Excellent. Tonight, he will be in Edmonton. Canadians are asking tough questions, questions that matter to them. We will continue to engage with them. Canadians are concerned about the economy, and Canadians have created 422,000 jobs in 2017, the best number since 2002. Thank you, Mr.
I could have sworn I heard the word serene a few minutes ago. Order.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, the Ethics Commissioner's report was unequivocal. The Prime Minister breached 4 sections of the Ethics Act, in addition to breaking his own rules when he accepted the invitation to the Aga Khan's private island with his family, and he reoffended when his family wanted to take another trip at the taxpayers' expense. Mr. Speaker, Canadians deserve answers. The day of reckoning has come. Can the Prime Minister tell us if he's going to take responsibility for his mistakes and pay back the value of this illegal gift? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister accepted responsibility. He accepted the recommendations. Since the beginning of the year, the Prime Minister has answered questions from Canadians in town halls. Canadians are more concerned about job creation for the middle class and those working hard to join it. With our plan, Canadians have created 420,000 jobs in 2017. That's an annual record since 2002. We understand the opposition doesn't want to talk about the economy because our plan is working. The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Canadian taxpayers are footing the bill for his family vacation down south. It's unthinkable that we should have to pay for these illegal trips for himself, his family, and his cronies. Mr. Speaker, the gift was illegitimate and illegal and should be paid back. When will the Prime Minister finally reimburse the taxpayer for the cost of his illegal vacations paid out of the taxpayer's pocket? The Honourable Government House Leader. Organizations tasked with providing security for the Prime Minister, as they always did for previous Prime Ministers, we follow their recommendations whenever the Prime Minister has to travel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Phil.
Mr. Speaker, when the former health minister repaid inappropriate expenses in 2016, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "The situation is a reminder for all of us to be extremely careful about our expenses and about the public trust that we wield." Now that the Ethics Commissioner has ruled that his vacation was illegal, why is the Prime Minister refusing to show the same level of respect for taxpayers? He knew the trip was wrong because he tried to hide it. If he truly accepts the Commissioner's finding of guilt, why won't he repay Canadians?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as I have just said in French, I shall repeat in English. The security agencies make determinations on what is needed to protect this Prime Minister, as they have done for previous Prime Ministers, and we follow their recommendations. The former Commissioner has acknowledged that these costs are incurred as part of the role of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister will continue to work with the Commissioner to clear future family vacations.
Excellent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Barrie Innisfil.
Such a double standard, Mr. Speaker. One set of rules for the Prime Minister, another set of rules for everyone else. Contemptible, hypocritical, and entitled is the only way to describe the Prime Minister's coached response and the coached response of those around him to being found guilty on 4 counts of breaking ethics rules. If this was any other workplace, this Prime Minister would be fired and at the very least would have to pay back what he would have to pay it back. But in this place, he can't be fired until an election, so we're asking him to pay the money back. Why won't he?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Many times that the Prime Minister accepted responsibility and accepted the findings. When the Conservatives were in government, they had a habit of undermining our officers of Parliament. And now that they're in the opposition, they continue to do the same. They, for weeks, for months, for a year even, were asking for the report to be released. Now that it's been released, they refuse to accept its conclusions. We will take responsibility. We have accepted the recommendations, and we thank the Commissioner for her work.
Excellent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Député d'Hochelaga.
The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. In 2017, there were over 4,000 opioid deaths in Canada. Only the government seems not to appreciate the extent of the crisis. And now it's moving east. In Hochelaga, there's a project, Dopalier, that educates drug users on safer practices. It's working and it's saving lives, but nobody knows if the funding will be renewed in April. Time's getting short. What's the holdup? What's the minister waiting for? These programs need to be renewed so that they can effectively fight the opioid crisis. The Honourable Minister of Health. This government is deeply concerned about the aggravation of the opioid crisis in Canada. We are taking action. We're investing heavily, and new legislation and regulations are being expedited. In the future, we will continue to work with the provinces and territories in order to increase access to treatment and bring new approaches to the fight against the use of opioids. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work with our partners. Thank you.
Well, the numbers are in. In 2017, a staggering 4,000 Canadians died from opioid overdoses, an unprecedented 1,400 people in British Columbia alone. But this is not an opioid crisis. It is not an overdose crisis. It is a crisis of social isolation and bad drug policy. Jagmeet Singh has proposed the only real solution: treat addiction as a health issue, not a criminal one. When will this government abandon the failed war on drugs and adopt a health-based approach to addiction and drug use?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we recognize that we are
facing a national public health crisis due to an opioid overdose, and our government is treating this as a public health issue and not a criminal matter. We are not looking at decriminalizing or legalizing any other drugs aside from cannabis, as decriminalization would not ensure quality control of drugs, and there would still be the risk of contamination on the streets. By streamlining the application process for supervised consumption sites and giving legal protection for those who seek emergency help during an overdose, we are working towards improving access to treatment and social services for those who need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Mr. Speaker, the House Leader just doesn't seem to understand. The Prime Minister has been found guilty of committing an illegal act. He took a gift worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from someone who was at that moment doing business with his government. Doesn't she understand that the Prime Minister broke the law?
Good question. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I understand. I understand that I was elected here by the people of Waterloo to represent their concerns. The Prime Minister had confidence in me, asked me to become a minister, asked me to become the Government House Leader, to take on those responsibilities seriously. While the Conservatives continue to be focused on the Prime Minister and this government will continue to be focused on Canadians, the very real challenges that they are facing. If you notice, Mr. Speaker, we've been engaging with Canadians. We have a plan that's working. 422,000 jobs created by Canadians for Canadians because of our plan is working. You know why the Conservatives don't want to talk about the economy? Because they know our plan is working.
The Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was found guilty of violating 4 sections of the Conflict of Interest Act when he took a private vacation on the Billionaire's Island in the Caribbean. We have been asking a very simple question for the last 4 days. The responses have been inadequate, they have been shameful, and they have been disrespectful to this place.
Here.
They're saying, nothing to see here. Oh, the Prime Minister broke the law. It doesn't matter. Move on. This is important. Why will the Prime Minister not pay back the money to Canadians?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we have said every single time the same question's been asked over and over again is immediately after the report was released, the Prime Minister accepted the recommendations, accepted responsibility. The Prime Minister will continue to focus on Canadians so that we can ensure that the economy and our strategic investments are working for them. We are here for Canadians, by Canadians. Those are the very people we serve. While the Conservatives will continue focusing on the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister and this government will continue focusing on Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Chilliwack, Hope.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we seem to be getting nowhere with the scripted answers from the Government House Leader. But fortunately, there was another member of this House who had a front-row seat on this illegal vacation. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Veterans Affairs, did he incur any expenses that he billed to taxpayers for the trip? And does he think the Prime Minister should pay back Canadians for the $200,000 he's billed them for this illegal vacation?
Honourable Government House Leader. Order. The Honourable Government House Leader has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we have said, immediately after the report was released, the Prime Minister accepted responsibility and he accepted the recommendations. It was the opposition that thought that the Commissioner should investigate. The Commissioner has investigated. She has released her report. We have accepted the recommendations. The Prime Minister has accepted responsibility. Mr. Speaker, while the Conservatives continue to focus on the Prime Minister, this Prime Minister and this government will continue to focus on Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Chilliwack, Hope.
Mr. Speaker, the only recommendation was a finding of guilty. And if a Canadian taxpayer files a false expense claim when they file their taxes, and the taxman finds out they've broken the law, they don't get to keep their ill-gotten tax return and just say, sorry, won't do that again. They have to pay it back with interest in penalties. Once again, there's one set of rules for the Prime Minister and one set of rules for everyone else. So why won't the Prime Minister finally do the right thing, pay back the ill-gotten gains that he billed to taxpayers, pay the money back?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as I have said the Prime Minister accepted the recommendations and accepted responsibilities. It's clear that the Conservatives will talk about anything except for the economy. They praise themselves on being stewards of the economy. What they could not do in 10 years, we have been able to accomplish in 2 years, Mr. Speaker. 422,000 jobs created by Canadians for Canadians, the highest number since 2002. We will continue to engage with Canadians. We will continue to respond to the very real challenges they are facing. They know that our plan for the economy is working. Thank you.
Order. Let's hear from one at a time. The honourable member for Skeena Bulkley Valley.
You know, Mr. Speaker, most anniversaries we like to celebrate, but today is a day that Liberals are hoping Canadians forget all about, because it was a year ago today that Liberals and their Prime Minister broke a sacred oath to Canadians to make 2015 the last election under first past the post. Yet despite this betrayal, hope is alive in Canada. All opposition parties in Quebec have promised to bring in proportional representation. Prince Edward Islanders voted for it. And in my home province of British Columbia, Premier John Horgan will be campaigning for it in the fall. So if the Liberals want to restore a little faith, help elect more women, and truly make every vote count, will they show just a little bit of contrition, apologize, and get to work on real electoral reform?
Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to strengthening our democracy, Canadians want us to focus on what unites us, not on what divides us. We listen to Canadians. They expect us to protect the integrity of our democracy. My job is to strengthen and protect our democratic institutions and ensure they represent the values of Canadians. Through the introduction of Bill C-33 and Bill C-50, we are moving to accomplish that mandate. I know every member of this House shares the deep affection Canadians have for our democracy. Canadians want us to work together on priorities that unite us, and that is where our focus will remain. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, after several access to information requests were made, the government finally made public 773 pages of emails between Ottawa and Netflix, 90% of which were redacted. It's as if there's something to hide. In a year-end statement, the Prime Minister dared tell Céline Galipo that it wasn't possible to impose the HST on Netflix, when we know that that's the opposite of the truth, and he knows it. Why does the government persist in misleading the government on the Netflix agreement? Why don't they come clean and simply publish the agreement? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Mr. Speaker, today we have good news. We have Netflix doing Quebec production here. Congratulations to Robert Aubert and his team. Finally, this film is going to be seen by over more than 100 countries. However, under the Investment Act, we can make sure that new and foreign investment helps production, and yet there is confidentiality at the same time to protect commercial information for businesses who are investing here. Canadians know more or less what the agreement is. They know the outline of it, and we're very satisfied. The honourable member for Sudbury.
We run on a platform to help the middle class and those working hard to join it, including middle-class families like those in my riding of Sudbury. We put in place the Canada Child Benefit, which puts more money tax-free in the hands of 9 out of 10 families. We did this by ending the Conservative practice of sending checks to millionaires. The Conservatives voted to keep sending checks to millionaires. Can the government explain the importance of focusing on those who need it most?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for his question. And indeed, the member is right. For a decade, the Harper Conservatives focused on giving boutique tax credits that benefited to some but not all. And they're at it again today with a proposed tax credit, non-refundable tax credit, that does nothing for the self-employed and small business owners, that does nothing for low-income workers, that does nothing for those who don't qualify for EI, that does nothing for those who lost their job and are looking for one. We've taken a different approach with the Canada Child Benefit, one that's helping 9 out of 10 Canadian families, that's giving more to those who need it the most. That's the right approach for the Canadian dream to be alive and well in this country.
The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, we learned that 35 cannabis producers licensed by the federal government receive financing from unknown investors in tax havens. And we also know, contrary to the minister's claims, that the plan to check the records of investors being proposed by the Liberals does not apply to the majority of industry players. In other words, it's a plan that's full of holes. Can the minister assure us that organized crime has not infiltrated the Prime Minister's marijuana program?
For public safety.
Mr. Speaker, one prime objective of our whole new regime on cannabis is to stop the flow of illegal cash to organized crime. That includes on the selling end of the equation, and it certainly includes on the investor end of the equation. Under our proposed regulations, security clearances will be mandatory for individuals who occupy key positions in any organization, as well as background checks on significant investors who hold more than 25% of any particular company.
The honourable member for Charlesbourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the minister is giving me more or less the same answer I got from the Minister of Health yesterday. So it looks like there's a bit of confusion about what's legal and what's illegal and how you control it. Can the Minister of Public Safety confirm that before going any further with C-45, all those security checks will be done in order to avoid organized crime from being involved in the Prime Minister's marijuana program?
Mr. Speaker, the regulations that will be promulgated under this new legislation will indeed require security clearances. In addition, the Minister of Finance recently reached an agreement with his provincial and territorial counterparts to ensure that we know who owns switch corporations, which will help prevent Canadian or international companies from facilitating tax evasion, money laundering, or any other criminal activity.
Honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, a state-controlled Chinese company is in the process of taking over one of Canada's largest construction companies. Not only does this raise security concerns in terms of critical infrastructure, but construction companies across the country are raising concern about thousands of job losses. Will the minister commit to conducting a full security review of the sale and extending the period of time for a rigorous net benefit assessment under the Investment Canada Act?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, global companies want to invest in Canada precisely because of our skilled workforce and our strong innovation economy. Our government is open to investment that will grow our economy and will create good middle-class jobs. The Investment Canada Act provides, Mr. Speaker, for a review of significant international investments to ensure that they are of an overall net economic benefit to Canada. And yes, Mr. Speaker, a security review is part of that process.
Honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, it is clear under this Liberal government that Canada is open to business to the Chinese Communist Party, Mr. Speaker. The government approved the sale of Norsat without a security review and despite the concerns of our American allies. The Prime Minister's hand-picked ambassador to China recently said that China has more in common with Canada than we do with the United States, Mr. Speaker. When will this government start taking security concerns seriously, and when will they extend the period of time on the Aecon sale to allow Canadian employers to have their say?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the Investment Canada Act provides for a multi-step review in all of these cases, which are reviewed on a case-by-case basis. It's a rigorous process, Mr. Speaker, in which we rely as a government on our national security experts. We believe in them. We have confidence in them. It's interesting that the opposition doesn't seem to have confidence in our national security review people.
The honourable member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, the Federation of Francophone and Acadian Communities gave the government an ultimatum. They're calling for supplementary funding to improve the situation of minority communities. It is time that the Liberals prove that they can do better than pay lip service to official languages. They make promises, but when it's time to deliver the goods, they just slink away. When will this government walk the talk and meet the requests of communities for funding? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Mr. Speaker, Francophone and Canadian communities have agreed on 4 points. That there was no reinvestment by the Harper government official languages, that these communities throughout the country need to be supported by the federal government, and third, that we will have a new action plan for official languages, and we've agreed that everything has to be done over the next 18 months. Thank you.
James Bay.
It's taken 2 years, $1 million in legal fees, 4 non-compliance orders for the Prime Minister to finally accept the ruling of systemic discrimination against First Nation children in foster care. And in that time, we have lost so many young people like Tammy Quiche and Courtney Scott and Kanina Sue Turtle. I thank the Minister for pushing Cabinet for compliance, and we will work with her. But we've heard these promises before. She needs to give us the dollar figure. How much have they been ordered to retroactively reimburse, and what will it take to end this shortfall and end this discrimination once and for all?
Honourable Minister of Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and for his commitment to work with us on this extremely important issue. Our government is firmly committed to addressing the severe overrepresentation of Indigenous children and child welfare in this country. To that end, we sent a letter today to 105 child and family services agencies in the country to instruct them that we are pleased to respond to all of the costs related to prevention services for children, not only going forward but going over the past 2 years. I'm also pleased to report that the tribunal noted that they were delighted to read of Canada's commitment and openness. And
the honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Mr. Speaker, the Trans Mountain Pipeline is on life support. The British Columbia government is throwing up regulatory roadblocks threatening to terminate this project. Canadian jobs and the economy are at risk. We are already witnessing Canadian oil and gas companies fleeing to the U.S., where recent investments in that sector are into the tens of billions of dollars. Despite all of this, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister chooses to look the other way. When the Prime Minister is in Alberta today, will he commit to fight the BC government and ensure this important project gets built?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the honourable member knows that we actually approved the pipeline. And we approved the pipeline because of the thousands of jobs that it will create.
Order. Order. We had a question. It's time to have the answer, and not for everyone to talk at the same time as the answer is being given, whether someone likes it or not. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member knows that this government understands the importance of opening up export markets for Canadian crude. He knows at the same time we announced an investment of $1.5 billion in the Ocean Protection Plan. Excellent. He probably knows that we are in constant conversation with Indigenous communities up and down the line to ensure its safety. What he may not know is that the Prime Minister of Canada in Edmonton this morning said, quote,
So we're going to have to wait for that. Now, member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, since the Minister mentions what the PM said being in Edmonton, today on CBC Radio, Edmonton, in response to what actions a PM could take to get the Kinder Morgan built, this was his response verbatim. It's still early on this, and we're still moving forward the way we always planned. What does that even mean, Mr. Speaker? Is that leadership? When will the Prime Minister stand up for the BC NDP and get this project built?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What the Prime Minister said was, we're going to get that pipeline built. And the reason he said that, as he has said from the very first days that this government took office, is that the environment and the economy go hand in hand. We're creating jobs for British Columbians and for Albertans and for all Canadians. We're expanding our export markets. We're working with Indigenous people. The environment, Indigenous partnership, and jobs. Those are the three pillars that drive the policy of this government. That pipeline will be built.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, The Liberal government is completely unaware of the reality facing Canadian producers. Not only do the producers have to face unpredictable weather, unpredictable markets, now they have to face the Liberals making it up as they go along. They were treated as tax cheats under the tax reforms. They were given a bad modernization program. And for 9 days now, since the TPP was announced, they haven't heard a word. The Conservative government had promised $4 billion. What's the Liberals' plan for dairy, egg, and poultry producers? Honourable Minister of International Trade, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question, Mr. Speaker. The first thing I did following the announcement of the CPTPP was to go and meet with the producers in order to determine together our path forward, and they welcomed that. But let's just recall what we have done for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. For the agricultural sector, we have 500 million consumers, 14% of the global economy, and we did this by advocating for our key sectors like automobile, culture. So that is a good thing for Canadians. It's a good agreement for the agricultural sector.
Member for Mississauga East Cooksville.
Mr. Speaker, during our government's review of Canada Post, Canadians in Mississauga East Cooksville and from coast to coast to coast made it clear that they value the important services that this Canadian institution provides. Last week, I was happy to join the Minister for an important announcement on the future of Canada Post at their largest distribution hub, which is located in my riding. Can the Minister please update this House and all Canadians to our government's new vision for the renewal of Canada Post?
Minister of Public Services and Procurement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for Mississauga East Cooksville for the question and for his work on this file. Our government was proud to announce a new vision for Canada Post that puts service to Canadians front and centre. We are taking immediate action to implement this vision, including terminating the community mailbox conversion program, enhancing the accessible delivery program, reinvesting profits in services and innovation, promoting remittance services, and renewing Canada Post's leadership. We made this promise to Canadians, Mr. Speaker, and we have kept our promise.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, after dedicating his life to the Canadian Armed Forces, Vice Admiral Mark Norman's career has been put on hold for over a year.
Shame.
The Prime Minister himself approved his suspension and publicly predicted that his case was going to end up in court without offering any explanation at all. But Ontario Judge Kevin Philp wrote that Vice Admiral Norman was carrying out his responsibilities expected of an officer of his rank. Why is the Prime Minister politically interfering in Vice Admiral Norman's case and denying him his right, yes, his right to due process by taking this so long?
Honourable Minister of National Defence.
As the member very well knows, this issue is under investigation, and it would be irresponsible for me to comment on this at this time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Deputy.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, the citizens of Salaberry-sur-Roi are showing the way to a green economy. They came together to find ways to start a true green shift. The government has a greenhouse gas emissions plan that is not based on any scientific data. Even the Commissioner of the Environment in the OECD say that the government will not manage to bring greenhouse gas levels to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. When will there be a real plan? When will there be major investments in transit and in ecological infrastructure to build a green economy? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that the environment and the economy go hand in hand. The NDP do not understand that you can grow the economy as well as fight climate change. And there are members as well, Conservative members, who don't think climate change is real. We know that we can go forward, we can tackle climate change, and we can also grow the economy at the same time. That's what we have to do to create good jobs. That's what we have to do for our children and our grandchildren. The Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Minister of International Trade announced a free trade agreement with 10 Pacific countries, the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Could the Minister tell us how the Constantin family and other family businesses in Saint-Eustache that produce maple syrup will benefit from the agreement.
We put more money in the pockets of producers and help grow our middle class.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her question.
Will open up doors for producers across Quebec and all across the country, whether it's beef, pork, grain, or other world-class maple syrup products. In Japan alone, tariffs of 70.5% on Canadian maple syrup and maple sugar will be eliminated in 3 years. This will create more growth and more opportunity for our maple industry and put more money in the pockets of our producers and help more people join the middle class. Thank you, Mr.
Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Mr. Speaker, pro-democracy media in China are speculating that Canada's ambassador has suffered a blow to the head. John McCallum bizarrely claimed that we have more in common with Beijing than our democratic allies. The government of China has absolutely no regard for human rights. Don't the Liberals know that human rights defenders, lawyers and activists are routinely arrested and tortured, that Christian churches are being demolished, Uyghur Muslims are being viciously oppressed, and dissidents' organs are being harvested? Can the Prime Minister explain which of these policies he and his ambassador have in common with the Chinese government?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, China is one of the largest and fastest growing economies in the world. Not engaging with that market would simply be unrealistic. However, we always do so standing up for Canadian values. That's because the promotion and protection of human rights is a core element of all of our engagement, domestic and foreign. We never have and we never will hesitate to raise human rights concerns with our Chinese counterparts. We do that at every opportunity, anytime there's a human rights concern that Canada has in the world.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, let's try and follow the logic, because there's someone who smoked some pretty good stuff when they wrote the cannabis bill. The Liberals are saying that it's true that tax havens may be the ones financing the pot industry. And they say that it's the Financial Markets Authority that makes sure that organized crime is not benefiting. But the problem is that the FMA doesn't know who the tax haven investors are. The Liberals are perfectly aware of this. Will the government delay implementation of this bill in order to make sure that organized crime and Liberal friends aren't the ones profiting?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, as we have said repeatedly, under the regulations that will flow from this legislation, security clearances will be mandatory for individuals who occupy key positions in any organization, as well as background checks on significant investors who hold more than 25% of a cannabis company. In addition, the Minister of Finance and his provincial counterparts have come to an agreement to demonstrate how we will all know what corporations are owned by whom.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister assure that the dirty and that the government will make sure that it's not organized crime behind this? Because based on his answer, that's what I seem to understand. So I'd like him to confirm that. Thank you.
For Public Safety.
Speaker, our concern with respect to organized crime has been a motivating factor behind this legislation from the very beginning. We want to stop the flow of illegal cash to crime organizations, and we certainly want to make sure that none of that cash is invested in Canadian cannabis operations.
I would like to draw to the attention of honourable members the presence in the gallery of the Honourable Paul Quassa, Premier of Nunavut. Honourable Robert McLeod, Premier of the Northwest Territories.
Member for Montcalm.
Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and 19 of his colleagues spent a lovely break week in India. Costumes, music, dance. The Prime Minister embarrassed us, of course, but we're criticizing him for having undermined the potential economic growth for Quebec. In 1 week, the Prime Minister insulted millions of sovereignists by comparing them to terrorists, just as he did to the government of Punjab. He then found a way of insulting the government of Punjab by calling them liars. He insulted the Indian government by inviting, along with the Canadian delegation, a Sikh terrorist. This Prime Minister sabotaged all our potential for economic growth in the future. And this could have really helped Quebec business. The Honourable Member for Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, yesterday was the 30th anniversary of the 1988 Sumgate tragedy in Azerbaijan. Events that happened over this week included serious acts of violence, riots, widespread pillage, during which Armenian civilians were attacked and killed. The civilian violence in Sumgate was unprecedented, and the atrocities there shocked the entire world. This anniversary makes us reflect on the privileges we enjoy as a country where diversity and inclusion make our strength, and where diverse communities, both religious and ethnic, can work together. It also reminds us that as Canadians we have a duty to condemn all acts of violence and to play an active role in promoting and preserving peace in Canada, but also worldwide. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Dufferin-Caledon.
Mr. Speaker, members may have noticed that there's a hint of spring in the air this week. In Dufferin-Caledon, that's a sign that our local home shows are right around the corner. In both Caledon and Orangeville, our home shows offer local businesses the opportunity to showcase their products and services to constituents thinking about sprucing things up this spring. In Orangeville, the 2018 Lions Home and Garden Show runs at the Orangeville Fairgrounds on April 6th, 7th, and 8th. Over 200 booths will be showcasing everything to do with home improvement, lawn and garden, and more. In Caledon, the Chamber of Commerce's Spring Home Show 2018 runs at the Albion Bolton Community Centre on April 20th, 21st, and 22nd. The show is a shop local experience where constituents can find out great deals on items related to their home and garden living. I would encourage all residents of Dufferin-Caledon to come and check out the Orangeville and Caledon home shows in April.
The Honourable Member for Montarville. Mr. Speaker, March is Fraud Prevention Month. During the month, initiatives will be taken to make consumers aware of white-collar crime and to remind Canadians that financial crime costs $5 million a year. I think often of the victims of fraud, of identity theft, corruption and counterfeiting. Over the last year, I've met with people who are on the front line of fighting white-collar crime. To my friends in the Competition Bureau, the Ontario Provincial Police, the Public Policy Research Institute, the Canadian Bar, and the RCMP, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Mr. Speaker, I would invite all my colleagues to join with me in helping Canadians better detect, thwart, report fraud. Thank you.
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians shouldn't have to worry about draining their savings or remortgaging their home for the sake of their health, and that's why the Canadian government should fight to protect and expand healthcare in Canada. Unfortunately, the Liberals are letting us down on both counts. They failed to protect Medicare when they held the provinces to Stephen Harper's miserly funding plan, when Saskatchewan violated the Canada Health Act by allowing private clinics to charge for insured services, made a little noise for show, and then looked the other way, Mr. Speaker. Recently, they had a tepid announcement about pharmacare, but the finance minister is already backpedaling on the promise. And once again, conflict of interest concerns swirl around the finance minister as Morneau Chappelle does big business consulting on private benefit plans. That's why the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions have called for him to retract his statements and recuse himself from the work of the National Advisory Council on Pharmacare. For too long, those who would make money on the back of sick Canadians have held up progress on a pharmacare plan. I urge him to take the advice of Canada's nurses and this government to get going on a real universal pharmacare plan.
The honourable member for Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, for over a century, on International Women's Day, we've made pledges and given flowers. It's not enough. Internationally, we need leadership to fully implement the women, peace and security agenda and to fight against gender inequality and gender-based violence. Canada's new National Action Plan is our response, and UN Resolution 1325 our commitment. Around the world, women and girls are strong survivors of horrific conflicts in which they are targeted. I call on all of us to stand with Yazidi, Rohingya, Sudanese women. It's why I introduced Motion 163 calling for a Women, Peace and Security Ambassador. Let us proactively institute programs that inspire participation of women in peacekeeping and for the prevention of conflict and gender-based violence. In partnership with our strong Canadian feminist movement, Budget 2018 committed $2 billion to advance gender equality and peace around the world. I call on all members to support M163.
The honourable member for Saskatoon University.
Mr. Speaker, actions have consequences, something this Liberal government seems to have forgotten. Take, for example, the Liberal implementation of an ideological litmus test for the Canada Summer Jobs Program. The requirement that applicants support the Liberal Party position on hot-button social issues actually hurts Canadian children. Which children, you may ask? How about the children in 24 Aboriginal reserves across Western Canada whose 5-day clubs have been historically funded through the Canada Summer Jobs Program? These children, some of whom come from difficult family situations, were able to benefit from a summer program that cared about their needs and brought a little joy to their lives for part of their summer. But because the sponsoring organization, Child Evangelism Fellowship, does not subscribe to Liberal values, it is ineligible to apply for funding. Child Evangelism Fellowship cares about these children on these reserves. If the Liberal Party also cared about them, they would drop the silly, irrelevant, ideological litmus test for the Canada Summer Jobs Program, so more children could be helped by these clubs.
Honourable member for Richmond Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this past Wednesday, I had the privilege of announcing our government support for 360 Kids Every Bite Matters program. This $800,000 program brought our government long-standing investment in 360 Kids to $3 million. Based in Richmond Hill, 360 Kids addresses the needs of risk at youth from all angles, surrounding kids in crisis with the much-needed care. Only by applying holistic support system can we do our part to help those youth most at risk. Tonight, for the 4th year in a row, I will participate in the 360 Kid experience, spending the night on the streets of York Region. This brief window into the reality facing our most vulnerable youth is an important perspective for any representative. I look forward to seeing 360 Kid flourish and continue their work with Richmond here most vulnerable, supported by a government that understands opportunities for youth are investment in our future. Thank you.
Honourable member for Winnipeg South.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next week, we will celebrate International Women's Day. It's an opportunity for all Canadians to celebrate women's contributions to our country and the progress we've made towards achieving gender equality. This year's theme is My Feminism. It highlights the importance of our own actions to end gender bias, gender stereotypes, and all forms of gender-based violence. It reminds us we can each be inspirational role models, especially for young people, and be part of the solution to creating a diverse, respectful, inclusive society. I invite all Canadians to join this conversation by using the hashtag MyFeminism. Describe what feminism means to you and share inspiring stories of how your friends, families, and communities are advancing equality. I would also like to welcome the students from the University of Toronto's Women in the House program. In particular, my shadow, Enza Gurgis. I hope some of you will be in the House someday.
need to remind honourable member for Winnipeg South and other members that only the Speaker draws attention to people who are in the galleries. The honourable member for Chatham-Kent Leamington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I had the pleasure of attending the grand opening of the Chatham Hope Haven Shelter for Homeless Men. It's not just a safe place to sleep, it's where staff and volunteers are able to help homeless men re-enter society and change lives for the better. After 2 years of renovations, the doors are open and overnight services are now available to homeless men in Chatham-Kent Leamington. The director of Hope Haven, Joe Simpson, took the time to thank the community and give special recognition to countless individuals who gave their time and money, including fundraising efforts by students from Indian Creek Public School, Berlin Legion, as well as monthly volunteer commitments from Emmanuel Baptist Church Youth Group, amongst other churches and organizations. Representatives of the Lions Club presented a check for $1,500 to the shelter. All in all, the shelter is a reflection of our community's love and commitment to help those most in need, with a warm meal, a warm bed, and a warm smile in a sometimes cold world.
The honourable member for Beaches East York.
Mr. Speaker, a constituent of mine recently lost her nephew to a fentanyl overdose. It's not the first loss that our country or my community has faced because of the opioid crisis, and if we don't keep working to change historic and failed drug policies, it won't be the last. In 2016, opioids killed almost 3,000 Canadians. Last year, over 4,000 Canadians. We need new solutions. We need to treat drug abuse as a health issue, expand harm reduction and treatment options, and remove the criminal sanction for low-level possession to stop stigmatizing the very people we want to save. I'm proud that our government has expanded safe consumption sites and provided over $200 million in this year's budget to address the opioid crisis, including to improve access to treatment services, but we need to do more. Portugal has proven that a public health approach can reduce problematic drug use, HIV transmission rates, and drug-related deaths, and significantly increase the number of people who seek treatment. Mr. Speaker, we need to follow the evidence to save lives.
The honourable member for Toronto Danforth.
Calling all feminists! International Women's Day is on March 8th. On a fait beaucoup de progrès, mais il y en a.
We've made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of work to do. This year's theme is My Feminism, and it underscores the importance of our own actions in putting an end to prejudice, stereotypes, and all forms of sexist violence.
Women around me who are doing so much for gender equity in business, in sports, yay Olympians, and for the arts. This weekend, I was at ACTRA Toronto's 75th Anniversary Awards. The president of the organization, Teresa Tova, brought everyone to their feet as allies against sexual harassment and in favor of gender equity. It was an inspiring moment. And the Awards of Excellence winner, Jennifer Podemski, exemplified standing up and making change. We can bring change together. Bonne Journée Internationale de Femmes.
Happy International Women's Day.
For Calgary Forest Lawn.
Ready to go?
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, let me take a moment today to tell this House why India matters. India is a vibrant democracy projected to be the 5th largest economy in the world. By next year, it is projected to be the fastest growing economy in the world. Canada is a home to 1.2 million Indo-Canadians, the 4th largest diaspora in the Western world. This diaspora has immensely contributed to enriching Canada's socio-economic fabric. Two Prime Ministers' visit and 2 Governor General's visit, of which I was part, cemented our solid relationship based on trade, people-to-people ties, and most importantly, on the world stage, shared values. The recent tourist visit by the Prime Minister to India, highlighted by immature diplomacy and liberal electoral interest, has crash-landed this important relationship, and it looks like a repeat of the former Liberal government's Canada-India tie. Mr. Speaker, a strong relationship with our Commonwealth partner is in the best interest of Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, today for the 3rd year in a row, I welcome to Parliament Hill dozens of children and representatives of the Sustainable Food Network for the Big Crunch event. Some of you join me in acknowledging the need to offer healthy food to our children. As we are developing a Canadian food policy and a healthy eating strategy, we should make sure that children are at the very center of our considerations. It's not just that I'm a grandfather and I want to tell children and I want to help them to be healthy. I want to help all Canadians. I'd like to thank this extraordinary Coalition for Healthy Eating at School and the network which supports this cause and advances it day in, day out. I would invite you to bite into an apple with me and 300,000 children to symbolize your commitment to better eating. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have been in this place since 2011 speaking out against Kinder Morgan's plan to build a new bitumen pipeline from Edmonton to Burnaby. I've warned the Prime Minister there will be dire consequences if he continues with his plan to ram this pipeline through communities and unceded First Nations territories without consent. I've warned the Natural Resources Minister that his threats to use the military against British Columbians will only serve to deepen the intensity of the opposition. And unfortunately, this is all coming true. A recent Insights West poll found 10% of British Columbians are willing to engage in civil disobedience to stop this pipeline. That's tens of thousands of people who are willing to be arrested to stop Kinder Morgan. And it's coming soon, Mr. Speaker. In a few days, Indigenous communities impacted by Kinder Morgan are beginning what they deem frontline resistance along the pipeline route and pledge to do, quote, whatever it takes to stop Kinder Morgan, including mass mobilization on March 10th. Mr. Speaker, it is madness for this government to continue with the support for this pipeline, and I urge them to stop.
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, over 46,000 Canadians signed a Beer Canada petition to remove the government's automatic escalator tax on beer. The Canadian beer industry supports 149,000 middle-class jobs, generates $5.7 billion in tax, and adds $13.6 billion to Canada's GDP. In a letter to the industry, the government calls this yearly escalator tax an inconsequential tax increase. But, Mr. Speaker, 47% of the price of beer in Canada is already taxed. Meanwhile, the United States federal government lowered its federal excise duty rates on beer, wine, and spirits as of April 1st. The top federal excise duty rate on Canadian beer will be 90% higher than the top U.S. rate. Beer drinkers in Canada pay close to $20 a case, while in the United States, beer drinkers pay about $2 in tax. To suggest that there's room to increase the Canadian beer tax rate even further is just not credible. Mr. Speaker, when will this government stop adding tax increases on top of tax increases?
The honourable member for Ajax.
I know, I'm sure. Mr. Speaker, as an alumni of the University of Toronto, it gives me enormous pleasure today to represent the nonpartisan group Women in House, who are taking part today following female MPs, absolutely, to address a very serious problem in this place, and that is the underrepresentation of women in this chamber. And these individuals are going to have the opportunity to shadow different members of Parliament, to learn about Ottawa and what a great place it is to work and how they can serve Canadians, to deal with issues like gender equality, and to get mentored and to get networking, and hopefully some of them are going to return here as leaders. Mr. Speaker, I want to particularly thank both Tina Park and the member for Toronto St. Paul's, who were responsible for creating this important initiative to make sure that we advance the important cause of having more women represented in this House.
Questions orales, oral questions. The honourable member for Milton.
Earlier today, President Trump announced new tariffs both on steel and aluminum. Canada is the #1 supplier of aluminum and steel to the United States. Can the Prime Minister update the House on whether or not he has confirmed with the President of the United States that Canada will be exempt from these tariffs?
Honourable Minister of International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, as you would expect, we are following the situation very carefully. Any tariffs or quota that would be imposed on our Canadian steel and aluminum industry would be unacceptable. Any such decision would have an impact on both sides of the borders, and Canadians rest assured that we will always be there to defend our workers and our steel and aluminum industry across this country, and we will stand firm for Canadian workers.
Honourable member for Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the National Security Advisor, in briefing the Canadian press on a trip to India, indicated that the Indian government sabotaged the Prime Minister's trip. Now, when the Prime Minister defended this official in this House, he actually elevated that defence into an official statement of Canada. And the Indian government has responded aggressively, saying that it is baseless and it's also unacceptable. This has been characterized as a serious rift in the relationship between Canada and India, and I'm wondering, what is the Prime Minister going to do to fix this diplomatic rift?
Honourable Minister of Science.
Mr. Speaker, as we have been saying, this invitation should never have been sent. As soon as it came to our attention, it was withdrawn, and the MP in question has taken responsibility. Canada's national security agencies are nonpartisan and both highly competent and effective. We trust them to protect and promote Canada's security. They continue to do an excellent job in serving and protecting the interests of Canadians.
Bravo. The honourable member for Milton.
Well, I appreciate the response from the member, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that we are far beyond invitations to any attempted murderers. Where we are right now is the reality that the Prime Minister is avoiding his responsibility, and as a result, we're being laughed at as a country across the world. The former High Commissioner from India likened the allegations of the Prime Minister of a sabotage conspiracy to something out of Harry Potter, calling it pure fiction. And a foreign affairs expert on CBC said the saga is a whodunit Harry Potter, Alice in Wonderland scheme. Right. Mr. Speaker, this is a complete embarrassment. What is the Prime Minister doing to fix the mess he created?
Honourable Minister of Science.
Mr. Speaker, we will always promote and defend the integrity of our public servants who accomplish incredible work. Unlike the previous government, we respect the nonpartisan nature of the public service, especially those who serve in national security agencies. We trust that advice and actions they take. All Canadians can be proud of their nonpartisan work, which our national security agencies carry out on a daily basis.
The honourable member for Richmond Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, no one's talking about our public service. No one's challenging the security services in Canada. What we're talking about here is the Prime Minister's main advisor, who is closely tied to him in his duties. And on Tuesday, the Prime Minister said in this House that the presence of Jaspal Atwal, the terrorist, alongside the Canadian delegation was the cause of a conspiracy by members of the Indian government that allegedly wanted to sabotage his trip to India. So my question is simple. Does the Prime Minister still believe in the conspiracy scenario? And if yes, then can he table evidence of those assertions in this House? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as we have been saying, this invitation should never have been sent. As soon as it came to our attention, it was withdrawn, and the MP in question has taken responsibility. Canada's national security agencies are nonpartisan and both highly competent and effective. We trust them to protect and promote Canada's security. They continue to do an excellent job in serving and protecting the interests of Canadians.
The honourable member for Richmond Arthabaska. Order, please. Here is the statement made by the Indian Foreign Affairs Ministry. Allow me to categorically state that the government of India, including the security agencies, had nothing to do with the presence of Jaspal Atwal in India. Any suggestion to the contrary is baseless and unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, those words are serious. Does the Prime Minister agree with that statement? And if not, what can he do to prove the contrary? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as we have said, whether in this case or in their everyday work, all the nonpartisan security agencies do an exceptional job in the service of Canada's national interests. Canadians can be reassured that beyond the partisan nature of the Commons, the advice offered by these agencies is in no way contingent upon the ruling party. We respect our national security organizations and their public service, and Canada can be proud of all they do in the interests of Canadians.
L'honorable député de Berthier.
The honourable member for Berthier-Non-Mange.
Canadians are confused with the Liberals' promise around pharmacare. Not only is it unclear whether the Liberals will eventually, maybe one day, sometime in the future, go ahead with universal pharmacare program, it's even more troubling. Just one day after this big announcement, Canadians learned that the dice is already stacked. The Liberals plan to go forward with a means-tested system. Mr. Speaker, why is the government putting together this advisory council if they already know what they want to do?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we were very pleased to put forward a council, a committee to take a look at how we can ensure that we deal with getting pharmaceutical products to all Canadians. We are going to look for expert advice to tell us how best to do this. We know that the goal, making sure that every Canadian has access to pharmaceuticals, is critically important. We also know that listening to experts is important, and that's exactly what we intend to do as we hear back from the advisory committee on how we can move forward. Thank you.
The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé.
Promise around electoral reform, Mr. Speaker. Trois majeures organisations.
Three major organizations, including the Canada Labour Congress, have called for the minister to recuse himself from discussions surrounding the pharmacare program in order to avoid another conflict of interest, but also to avoid having him work against the interest of Canadians by attempting to influence the outcome of the consultation. Canadians want and need a pharmacare program, a universal program today. Will the Prime Minister remove the Minister of Finance from the discussions, and can he ensure that the consultation is not simply a tactic to win some time?
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, we are considering how we will move forward with a system for Canadians to have medication they require. We have decided to have a council of experts to focus on how we will proceed, and that is very important for our government. We will listen to the experts.
New Westminster Burnaby.
Another day, another conflict of interest, and here we've got the involvement of Morneau Shepell. It's like they never had an idea to steal the idea of a pharmacare program from us. Well, the Liberals are sabotaging the idea. They're sabotaging our ideas, Mr. Speaker. Why are the interests of Canadian families placed behind the interests of Morneau Shepell and the ultra-rich?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, it's a bizarre question. We think that the idea of actually having experts help us to actually come forward with a way that we can actually get pharmaceuticals to all Canadians is important. I guess the members opposite would have us not have experts involved. Well, I can tell you what would happen if that were the case. We could have the NDP and the member from Carleton do the policy, because that's the way we'd have no expertise at all.
Honourable order. The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Canadians are not going to wait another 21 years because of Liberal waiting. Now, Liberals promise yet another study one day and then literally the next day admit that they have no intention of ever bringing in universal pharmacare. The PBO says Canadians would save over $4 billion per year. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians who can't afford medication would be helped. Businesses would be helped by reducing costs. The only one not helped is Morneau Shepell. We need to act. The Prime Minister hasn't stolen the NDP plan, he has vandalized it. Why won't this government bring in real universal pharmacare now?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are proud of our publicly funded universal Medicare system, one based on the individual's need and not the ability to pay. Yet, we recognize there's certainly room for improvement. We have created a National Advisory Committee on the implementation of pharmacare, with its mandate to study, evaluate, and ultimately bring recommendations to government on possible options. This initiative will build on the good work that's already been started by the HESA Committee, and we look forward to the report that we'll be receiving next spring. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, the Member of Parliament for Surrey Centre is no longer the BC Caucus Chair. Whether he was fired or resigned is only known between the Prime Minister and himself. But what Canadians do know is that a Liberal MP has acknowledged to be the person that invited a convicted terrorist to the Prime Minister's Indian events. So why is the Prime Minister clinging to this preposterous theory that it was the Indian government? Why is the Liberal government levying unfounded attacks on our friend in India when one of their own caucus members has accepted responsibility?
Secretary of the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, as we've been saying all along, this invitation should never have been sent. Once we were made aware of this individual's background, the invitation was rescinded. The member has apologized. And let me say that we respect tremendously the nonpartisan, incredible work that the men and women do in our national security agencies every single day. We take their advice and we act on it accordingly.
Honourable Member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, what we do know is that member in 2010 said it was unfair for a cloud of suspicion to hang over a community. They're allowing a cloud of suspicion to hang over a country of over 1 billion people, Mr. Speaker. What we know is that the Indian government has said the conspiracy theory claims of the Prime Minister are baseless. The Liberal MP for Surrey Centre has said the Indian conspiracy claims are not correct. Even the Prime Minister's friend Jasbal Atwal, have called the Indian conspiracy claims a lie, Mr. Speaker. To stop the diplomatic bleeding, will the Prime Minister retract his remarks?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has been preeminently clear in our trust for our nonpartisan public service. We stand behind them full force. I do remember in 2010, if the member wants to talk about that date, watching the cuts that happened to our security and intelligence infrastructure, hundreds of millions of dollars. I do remember in 2006 the Justice O'Connor's inquiry, which was ignored. I remember Yakabuchi in 2008, ignored. Important flaws in our security infrastructure that were not fixed. Mr. Speaker, we are fixing it.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the answers are always the same and they make no sense. So let's go slowly here. First thing, the Prime Minister believes there's a conspiracy by the Indian government to damage relations between the two countries. 2, he decided to punish one of his MPs for having invited a convicted terrorist, Jasbal Atwal, to an event organized by the High Commissioner. 1 + 1. Does that mean, then, that the MP and the government are conspiring against Canada?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, same question, same answer. We have full confidence in the services provided by our public service. The Prime Minister has said that, and I will reiterate that answer. The Honourable Member. Okay, so if I understand the answer then, it's that India conspired to create problems between India and Canada. That's what he's saying. And then, if that's the case, we need proof. Do you have the proof that confirm that India took steps to damage the relationship between the two countries?
Monsieur le Président, je rejette.
Mr. Speaker, I reject the assertions being made by the member opposite. An invitation was issued. When that was realized, it was withdrawn immediately. We have full confidence in our security services.
Mr. Speaker, we know two things. First, the Prime Minister believes that the Indian government is responsible for a convicted terrorist embarrassing him on his trip. And second, the Liberal MP has been punished for inviting that convicted terrorist on their trip. So my question is to the Prime Minister, how can these two things both be true? When will the Prime Minister stop hiding the facts and show us the evidence?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I know 3 things. Number 1, that when the individual in question was found out to have the information that was there, that invitation was rescinded and the Member of Parliament apologized. Secondly, I know that that this party always, in every way, makes sure that we respect our nonpartisan, independent, phenomenal individuals that work within our public service. And I know 3, Mr. Speaker, the party opposite, the Conservatives, when they were in power, did not.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians want answers because the Liberals are just making no sense. Why did the Surrey Centre MP apologize and resign his position as BC Liberal Caucus Chair, independently or otherwise, for something the Prime Minister himself said he believes the Indian government did? This is all as ridiculous, damaging and disastrous as the trip was itself, and these Liberals should be ashamed.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I've answered the question very clearly that the individual, once we found out the information, that invitation was rescinded, that the member apologized, but I reject totally the assertion that was made about the trip. The reality is more than $1 billion was achieved in cross-border trade, more than 580,000 good middle-class jobs were created for Canadians. Important frameworks were established to continue our trade with India. It was important work that we're going to continue to build on.
The honourable member for Laurier Sainte Marie. Mr. Speaker, when a Prime Minister spends a week in another country, people expect him to come back with some results, significant results, and positive results, ideally. Almost a week has gone by since his return, and we still don't know what the purpose of the trip was. We need leaders who focus 100% on citizens' needs instead of focusing on themselves and the interests of their party. So when will we finally be told what the real reasons for this trip were?
The
Honourable Minister. I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. The trip was to strengthen cultural and economic links with India. Mr. Speaker, we brought in more than $1 billion in announcements of investments. Jobs will be created. It follows up on the mission that back in November, the trade mission, and this is what we expect of a Prime Minister, to bring home positive news for the economy, for Canadians. That's exactly what the Prime Minister did.
This morning I wrote to the Prime Minister asking him to provide parliamentarians with a security briefing over his allegations about the alleged interference by the government of India and how alleged convicted assassin and Liberal insider Jaspal Atwal was given access to the Prime Minister's delegation, because those allegations made in Parliament an enormous damage to Canada's credibility and the Prime Minister's. So will he provide Parliament with the evidence in a briefing, or is this him using the Donald Trump damage control playbook of self-serving political Pinocchioism?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, as I have said, and I will reiterate, the invitation that was sent was rescinded when the information found out was that the individual should never have received that invitation. The member in question has apologized, and we say that we have full and total confidence in our national security infrastructure, in the nonpartisan advice that they give us. That is advice that we take very seriously and listen to in all instances.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, agriculture, 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 agriculture. In a few seconds, I said more about agriculture than the Minister of Finance last Tuesday in his 40-minute budget speech. Nothing for dairy, eggs or poultry producers, nothing for grain transportation in the West, nothing. Risk management, nothing. Agriculture, nothing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Agriculture once again failed to rise to speak on behalf of farmers. Why is the Liberal government ignoring farmers?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Order.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question. The budget builds on Budget 2017 that identifies agriculture as a key sector. We invested $150 million in the protein supercluster. We invested $100 million in agricultural science, $70 million and $30 million, after millions were cut from the budget by the previous government. We invested $75 million to promote Canada's trade with China. We invested $350 million to make sure our dairy industry remains stable, Mr. Speaker, and to make sure it stays on the country.
Honourable Member for Prince Albert.
Mr. Speaker, for farmers, timing is everything. There's a specific time to plant, to spray, to harvest, and in most cases, winter is the time to deliver when the roads are frozen and can carry the weight. In the next few weeks, road bans will go into effect, making it impossible for farmers to move their crop from farm to elevator. The clock is ticking. Farmers are in a cash flow crisis, and time is of an essence. When will this minister order the railways to do their job and deliver this year's crop?
Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my honourable colleague's question, and we know this is a serious situation. That is why we introduced Bill C-49 to establish a strong, reliable and efficient grain transportation system for the long term. The Minister of Transport and I both have contacted CN just to indicate how serious it is that they continue to need more grain faster. I have spoken to the grain farmers, Mr. Speaker, and indicated to them that we are fully aware of the seriousness of this situation.
Honourable Member for Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals ignored our advice to pass a separate grain transportation bill. When they failed to extend important provisions like interswitching, the Liberals have allowed for this grain backlog crisis. We have seen the worst railcar performances of the year, and the numbers are only getting worse. And yet the Minister of Agriculture had the nerve yesterday to tell farmers when it came to the backlog situation, and I quote, "It's not real serious at this moment." When will the Minister of Agriculture understand how serious this is and start taking some action?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, our government has proven time and time again that it is strongly committed to Canadian farmers and to the agriculture industry. Unlike the previous Harper government's Band-Aid solution with an expiry date, this government put forward a permanent and sustainable solution in Bill C-49 that would meet the long-term needs of farmers. To quote the Western Grain Elevators Association, this bill is a significant improvement over the existing legislation and a positive step forward for the grain industry.
Member for Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have to stop blaming others for their mismanagement on the grain backlog issue. They can take definitive action now to address this situation, but they refuse. And you know who's suffering the consequences? Are Canadian grain farmers. In some areas, railcar performance was 6% last week, and it is only getting worse. Our reputation as a reliable grain exporter is tarnished, and yet the Minister of Agriculture can't even stand up and defend Canadian farmers. How bad does this situation have to get before the Liberals stop defending the rail monopoly and start fighting for Canadian farmers?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, both ministers are very well aware of the situation. In fact, both ministers had conversations with CN and CP about this issue. They have asked them for a plan. They need to see improvement on this issue. If there is not improvement, the ministers are willing to intervene. We are going to give the companies the first chance to improve this process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I have to thank the member for Foothills for apologizing for his short outburst there.
The honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Mr. Speaker, this week the Liberals gave hope that we would finally get a universal pharmacare system. But 24 hours later, this false hope was destroyed by the Minister of Finance, who revealed that the coverage would be neither universal, nor public, nor free. And yet the studies have been clear. The experts have already spoken. Setting up a national pharmacare system means reducing inequality and allowing Quebec's men and women to stop paying for private plans that are beyond their means. Why are the Liberals not acting now? The Honourable Minister for Health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All Canadians are proud of their universal health care system. It is funded publicly, and it responds to needs instead of capacity to pay. Of course, it could be improved. We have set up a consultative group on pharmacare. This committee will study and evaluate the situation and make recommendations to the government. It will continue to do the excellent work that the Health Committee started, and we are looking forward to their recommendations.
For Vancouver Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, quote, "Many Canadians have limited prescription drug coverage and 12% have no coverage at all. This situation is plainly inconsistent with the values upon which Medicare is based. It is illogical to guarantee access to medical diagnosis but not the treatment, nor does it make economic sense. Together with key partners, a new Liberal government will develop a national plan and timetable for introducing universal public coverage. What am I quoting, Mr. Speaker? The 1997 Liberal plan. Liberals failed Canadians then. Why should we believe them now?
Honourable Minister, order. Honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway is, of course, an experienced member and knows that you're not allowed to use props in this place. The Honourable Minister of Health. Order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's no surprise to hear the NDP try to implement an idea without a plan. Well, we're moving forward with a plan. We have created a National Advisory Council on the implementation of a national pharmacare program. Its mandate is to study, to evaluate, and to bring recommendations to our government I say recommendations, Mr. Speaker, because we want to get this right. This initiative is going to build on the good work that the Health Committee has done in this House, and I am looking forward to hearing their recommendations in spring of 2019.
Member for Ottawa West Nepean.
Mr. Speaker, next week on International Women's Day, we will be reminded of the important role that women play in shaping our communities both here in Canada and around the world. Although we've seen significant progress, there is still progress to be made in assuring real gender equality. As we approach International Women's Day, could the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Status of Women please tell this House how Budget 2018 will contribute to helping to close the gaps and ensuring that women have real equal opportunities to succeed?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
To thank the member for Ottawa West Nepean for the excellent question. And Mr. Speaker, as we get set to celebrate the contributions and achievements of women on International Women's Day, I am pleased to say that our government is taking concrete actions towards gender equality, putting gender at the heart of decision-making by legislating Gender-Based Analysis Plus, recognizing the important role of the Status of Women Canada by making it a full department, and, Mr. Speaker, investing $100 million for a strong, sustainable women's movement. Mr. Speaker, when women succeed, we all succeed, our economy succeeds.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, never has a government spent so much for such paltry results. That is the outcome of the Liberal budget presented this week, and the worst of it is the deficit is $18 billion, 3 times higher than what was promised. Mr. Speaker, we're not the only ones who are worried about this. The Premier, the Liberal Premier of Quebec, even said that in a period of economic growth, budgets must be balanced. My question for the Minister of Finance, he who says that he's good as math, can he give us a number? When will we go back to balanced budgets? The Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I would like to tell the member that it's a good idea to go to his writing to consider the budget. Our level of economic growth is the highest in the G7. We've created 600,000 new jobs over the last few years. Those are results. It's a great situation for Canadian families. We decided to invest into Canadian men and women, and it's giving us real results for people throughout our country. That's the right way to run the economy. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. With pleasure. I'm happy to invite the Minister of Finance to my writing anytime he wants, but that's not my question. My question is a simple one. When will we go back to balanced budgets? Because everyone who knows the economy knows that it's not right to run deficits when the economy is doing well. Sylvain Gébert from Raymond Chabot to Grant Thornton said that the Minister of Finance had better pray for the Canadian economy to keep doing well. It's a very dangerous game to keep running deficits when the economy is doing well. My question is simple. When do we go back to balanced budgets? The Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, we had a debate in our country with one question. Do we have to make cuts and implement austerity, or do we have to invest into Canadians? Canadians made the right choice to improve the economy, the right way to improve their situation. We have made investments into our country, into our families, and what's happening? Very high economic growth. This is an excellent situation for all Canadians.
Carlton.
Talk is cheap, except when this finance minister does it. It's very expensive. He said the deficit would be just $6 billion this year. Instead, it's $18 billion. He said it would be balanced next year. Now that won't happen for another quarter century. In fact, while he was delivering his budget speech, the national debt grew by $1.5 million. That's either too much spending or too much talking. Which is it?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I think we had a debate a couple of years ago in the country. We had to decide between cuts and austerity or investments in Canadians. So let's consider the results. Fastest growth in the G7 and the lowest unemployment in about 40 years. So in the face of these facts, it's incredible to me. It's only the Conservatives that we consider with sheer incompetence to go back to the Harper Conservative approach to austerity and cuts. We're making a difference for Canadians, growing the economy and getting them jobs.
Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the finance minister is like the rooster who thinks that he made the sun come up just because he crowed when the sun came up. In fact, he inherited temporary good fortune from oil prices that are up by 100%. By a housing bubble in both Vancouver and Toronto, by massive household indebtedness, which has put our economy on a short-term sugar high. Why has this finance minister spent the cupboard bare in the short-term good times, leaving us so exposed to danger in the long-term future?
I think colleagues will know that it's probably best for order in this place if we don't compare members to barnyard animals. So, the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I hate to let facts get in the way of rhetoric, but perhaps we can consider what actually was the inheritance that this government took from the previous government. Unemployment rates over 7%. Situation where we've seen the lowest growth rate since the Great Depression. And what's happened since then, Mr. Speaker? Our approach of investing in Canada, we've got highest growth rates in the G7. We've got the lowest unemployment rates we've seen in 40 years. And where are we now? A fiscally responsible approach to keep investing in the long term in this country so this generation, the next generation, and future generations will be better off.
Honourable Member for Churchill, Newcastle.
Mr. Speaker, while the Prime Minister was travelling around the world with his chef in tow, the reality is that more and more Canadians are being left behind. People in Churchill are facing skyrocketing food prices. They're going hungry because of the kind of policies and incompetence of this government that has led to the loss of the rail service. When will the Prime Minister recognize that his globe-trotting selfies and his photo-op tours are doing nothing to help Canadians? And when will he get to work to act on the real challenges that people in Churchill and across the country are facing today?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for her question. Our government remains committed to the people of Churchill and northern Manitoba, and we recognize the importance of that rail line for that community. We will continue to support the government's negotiation and the ongoing discussions with interested buyers, Indigenous groups and community leaders. We're optimistic that we can make progress on this, and we need a sustainable business plan towards owning and operating that line. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Last week, the Wild Fish Conservancy released lab results showing 100% of escaped salmon tested were infected with the highly contagious virus PRV. 100%, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal rhetoric about strong regulations and environmental protection for salmon mean nothing. The burden of proof for that PRV does not cause harm to wild salmon doesn't rest on the fish. The minister needs to act. When will the minister get these disease-ridden farms off the wild salmon migration route and on land?
Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague knows very well that our government is deeply concerned about the state of the wild salmon populations in British Columbia. We have invested literally tens of millions of dollars in enhanced science, monitoring, auditing process to ensure that the protection of wild Pacific salmon remains a priority for our government. It's something that our Pacific Caucus has talked to us about over and over again. We understand, Mr. Speaker, that there needs to be robust aquaculture regulations. We understand that in conservation protection officers and increased monitoring is important, and we're going to work with the government of British Columbia to ensure that we have the toughest rules in place to protect this industry.
The honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, the Fisheries Minister has now had 3 days to reflect on a question I asked in the House earlier this week. I ask again and hope to actually get an answer this time. When the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans made a decision on Arctic surf clam quota, a quota that's worth millions of dollars, was he aware that the beneficiary of his decision was the brother of a Liberal caucus colleague member?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, when we made a decision to add a new entrant into this important commercial species, we knew that the most important people to benefit from this change were Indigenous Canadians on the east coast of Canada and in the province of Quebec. Mr. Speaker, the previous Conservative government had a process to add a new entrant to this fishery. They forgot to include Indigenous people. We had an open, competitive process where 7 bids were analyzed in detail, and we chose the one that offers the best economic opportunity for Indigenous people and Atlantic Canadians and Quebecers.
The honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, this minister and the Liberal government are completely out of touch with Canadians. By hand-picking winners and losers, this minister is jeopardizing middle-class jobs in Grand Bank and all across Newfoundland and Labrador. The mayor of Grand Bank has called this a devastating blow to his community. How can the minister justify this to the workers and their families, families whose livelihoods are at stake because of his decision?
Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, we understand and we respect the concerns of the people of Grand Bank and the people who work in that processing facility. My colleague who represents in this House of Commons that community has spoken to me about this important issue. So has the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. Mr. Speaker, we're committed to ensuring that the facility in Grand Bank and the workers who earn their living at that important facility have the benefit of an economic opportunity that's sustainable, that's long-term, and will continue to ensure that the economic opportunities in Grand Bank remain robust. But, Mr. Speaker, that party was also planning to bring a new entrant into the fishery, and they didn't seem concerned about Grand Bank then.
The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
The chair of the First Nations Financial Management Board said last year that the need for housing and infrastructure is between $20 and $30 billion. Then he said, quote, "Where is all that money going to come from if we don't engage in business and economic development?" So the Liberals' response: tanker bans, drilling moratoriums, taxes, increased red tape. They've actually, investment is fleeing, and they've impeded the opportunity for investment. Why are the Liberals putting up so many roadblocks for Indigenous economic prosperity?
Honourable Minister of Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to answer this question and to talk about things like the housing investments that were made in our federal budget this week. We have investments going $500 million for Métis housing, $400 million for Inuit housing, $200 million every single year for First Nations housing. We're working with our partners on developing a distinctions-based housing strategy to make sure that we address these gaps, get jobs for people, and get people homes to live in.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, since we've taken power, our government is doing everything it must to ensure that economic growth benefits the middle class. When the majority of Canadians are working hard and pay their taxes, some wealthy individuals or businesses that we know of are using strategies to avoid paying their fair share. Budget 2018 reaffirms the commitment of our government to fight tax avoidance and tax evasion. Can the Minister of National Revenue inform this House of new measures taken to make our tax system more fair? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague from Lac-Saint-Jean for being a strong voice for Quebec's regions. For 2 years, we've done a great deal to fight against those who avoid paying their fair share. The proof is that as of today, the new voluntary disclosure program is opening up. Budget 2018 has $100 million set aside in new investment. We have closed tax loopholes used by multinational corporations. The jaws of the trap are closing. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Lisette-Chamin-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, the Premier of Quebec, Philippe Couillard, is disappointed with Budget 2018. The Mayor for Lévis is as well. Why? Because there's nothing in the budget for Davie Shipyard's workers and contractors. And yet, Asterix was delivered on time. When will the Prime Minister grant the 4 icebreakers to Davie, proceed with building Obelix, and respect what was outlined in the shipbuilding strategy? The Honourable Minister of Public Services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my honourable colleague for his efforts for Davie's workers. They did excellent work on the Asterix, and we have set aside contracts for icebreakers. We are negotiating with Davie to meet the Coast Guard's needs. Before we will share the decision with everybody once we have one. The Honourable Member for Longueuil Saint-Hubert. I don't know a lot of people who got out of paying any taxes in Thursday's Liberal budget except for large web multinational corporations like Netflix. A nice gift paid for by everyday folks. The only response to the government to the calls from Quebec and the cultural sector when it comes to taxing these corporations is to set up a 5-year study and to talk about that with other G7 countries. But they're going to look silly because a great deal of these countries have already acted and set up taxes on these types of corporations. When are they finally going to act and stop setting up piecemeal deals with multinational corporations? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. We know that Quebec's media sector has changed because our way of using media has changed. That is why we've committed to modernizing our policy in order to meet issues linked to digital media. We've been very clear. We made promises and we will keep them. We recognize that over the long term, we will have to develop a global solution to the matter of taxation of digital platforms. But we won't do things piecemeal.
Johns East.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous children comprise 7.7% of all Canadians under 15 years of age, and yet they represent a whopping 52% of children in foster care in private homes. Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians alike, including my constituents in St. John's East, are demanding that this ongoing injustice be addressed. Can the Honourable Minister of Indigenous Services please update this House on what our government is doing to champion Indigenous child welfare? Thank you.
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member from St. John's East for this important question and his advocacy on this issue. I hope that all members in this House were heartened to see that there are new investments in the order of $1.4 billion to support child and family services for Indigenous families. This means that we will be able to achieve equity for First Nations child and family service agencies, but even more than that, we will be able to support communities with prevention services, ensuring that children can be raised by their families in their communities, surrounded by their language and culture, and I hope we are all working hard to that end.
Honourable Member for Peace River Westlaw.
Oddly, the Minister of the Environment shared a video of her celebrating with the Canada Parks and Wilderness Society, a group that's suing her government. Yet when it comes to meeting with organizations who are uniquely positioned to protecting caribou in the communities in which they live, the Minister suddenly has no time. Can the Minister confirm that she refused to meet with the Northwest Species at Risk Committee and the Alberta Forestry Alliance? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my job, I am happy to meet with as many people as I can, as do my public servants, as do my political team. I was very pleased that we announced $1.3 billion for parks and protected areas. Budget 2018. This is amazing for Canadians. This is amazing to tackle climate change. This is amazing for species at risk. It also demonstrates the environment and the economy go together.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, Quebec's forests are being ravaged by a budworm infestation, and it seems like the federal government is doing all it can to make it worse. In 2014, the government gave twice as much money to New Brunswick as it did to Quebec to stop the infestation. But the budworm isn't shy about crossing borders, and the infested area in Quebec is bigger than all of New Brunswick. New budget, Mr. Speaker. Same lack of support for our forestry producers. $75 million for the Maritimes. Not a penny for Quebec. Not one. What will it take for Quebec to get its fair share? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
A critical importance of forestry to the economies of Eastern and Western Canada as a source of jobs, prosperity and opportunity. We are acutely aware of the threat that forest pests like the mountain pine beetle, emerald ash borer and spruce budworm pose to Canada's forests. In Budget 2016, we invested $87 million to support scientific research and infrastructure, including funding to combat destructive forest pests, such as the spruce budworm and the mountain pine beetle. We are working closely with provinces, universities and industry, all with the common goal of finding a way to keep these pest populations low.
The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, Quebecers are badly served. In the past, Ottawa found $225 million to help British Columbia deal with a similar infestation. This year, Ottawa is extending $25 million to the Maritimes, but nothing for Quebec. Nothing for forested areas as vast as an entire province that have been infested and ravaged. Forests that are useless for the forestry sector and ruinous for private property owners. How can the government justify giving other provinces and completely ignoring support for Quebec?
Hardly ignoring the forest industry, including the forest industry in Quebec. And we were very pleased to announce an $867 million softwood lumber package in response to unwarranted countervail and anti-dumping duties of the United States. We continue to have very important conversations with the government of Quebec, with the Minister of Forests in Quebec, working to make sure that our forests are protected not only for today, but for tomorrow.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway has a point of order arising from question period.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to apologize to all of my colleagues in the House for holding up the document, the 1997 Liberal platform. That's the wrong way to remind Canadians of the broken promises of the government. So I'd like to seek unanimous consent to table the 1997 Liberal election campaign platform that promised
Order, unanimous, there's no unanimous consent. Order. J'ai l'honneur d'informer la...
I have the honor of...
Sympathies to the families directly affected by last week's tragic events, to the community of Humboldt, and to all Saskatchewanians. Having spent my childhood, adolescence, and early adult life in that wonderful province, I was extremely saddened. In a province that is so community-oriented and where personal relationships amongst community members are so strong, there is clearly great sorrow. However, these strong bonds that exist between neighbours and between communities have and will be a source of strength as Saskatchewanians struggle to come to grips with the impacts of the accident. All Canadians mourn with the families, with Humboldt, and with Saskatchewan. On behalf of my constituents, my family, and myself, I would like to express our deepest condolences to the families, to the community, and to all Saskatchewanians.
The Honourable Member for Prince George Cariboo.
Mr. Speaker, I, like many Canadians, all Canadians, were absolutely heartbroken by the news of the Humboldt Broncos tragedy. While I did not personally know any of the players or coaches, like many Canadians from coast to coast to coast, I too have spent countless hours on the bus, first as a player and then as a coach. It is what we have to do in rural communities if we choose to play sports or participate in events. At the beginning of a season, when parents bring their children to the rink to join our team, they are placing their trust in us as coaches and as an organization to protect their children. Their children become our children. They become our family. And just as we would with our own children, we agonize over every detail to ensure the safety of their children on and off the ice. Mr. Speaker, my heart has been filled with incredible sadness since the first hearing this news. This scenario has been played out in our minds over and over and over again. This indeed is amongst our worst nightmares. Since the news broke of the accident, former players, coaches, and volunteers have all reached out to me. The reaction is the same. We are all numb. I can imagine what was going on just before the accident. An iconic sports movie playing on the video, a poker game in the back, coaches sitting quietly thinking about the previous game and about tonight's lineup, and the quiet conversations of hopes and dreams. As a father, I can't even begin to imagine the pain the families are experiencing. The community of Humboldt, the surviving players, and the families of the deceased will need our nation's prayers, strength, and support for a very long time. Long after the cameras and the media go away, these communities and these families will need us all as a nation to continue to lift them up. This pain will endure long after the ice from this season has melted. Hearts will continue to break long after the final buzzer goes. On behalf of all families in my riding of Cariboo Prince George and our proud hockey teams, the BC Major Midget League Cariboo Cougars, the WHL Prince George Cougars, the BC Junior Hockey League Prince George Spruce Kings, our thoughts and prayers are with those who we have lost, those who are still fighting, the community of Humboldt, the Humboldt Broncos organization, and we ask that we all take a moment to also say a prayer for the families involved and as well for the first responders involved in this unbelievable tragedy. This will undoubtedly have an immeasurable impact on them as well. And Mr. Speaker, we ask that beyond today, we continue as a nation to embrace and lift these families up and hold them in our hearts. Thank you.
Honourable member for Fredericton.
A loving mother, wife, educator, and caring friend of many, Anne-Marie Eagles passed away last month after a long battle with cancer. Anne-Marie was strong in her faith and had a love of life that she shared oh so well with oh so many. Professeur et conseillère en
a dedicated teacher and guidance counselor, she delighted in instilling in her students the belief and abilities to achieve their dreams. In recent weeks, many former students have shared stories of how their time in Madame Eagle's classroom has had a lasting impact on their lives.
Poured at her passing reminds us of the tremendous impact of a simple, warm smile and the sincerity for well-being of others that can have such a large impact on a community. Together, we honor the life and legacy of this beloved and inspiring woman and send our thoughts and prayers to her husband Mike, sons Matt and Chris, and to the entire Eagles and Alain families.
Honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Wahiguru Chikakalsa, Shri Wahiguru Chikifate, Sobnu Vasaki di Laklak Vedai, Mr. Speaker. Men Umid Kardan Basaki da Tiohar Tuhadele Kusian Vala Hove. Wishing everyone, Mr. Speaker, a very joyous Vaisakhi from the NDP and from our national leader, Mr. Jagmeet Singh. And may the festival of Vaisakhi fill everyone with hope and happiness.
This festival celebrates human rights and emphasizes the fact that we are united. No matter your gender, ethnic group, sexual orientation, or identity of any kind, you should be free of any prejudice, oppression, or discrimination.
Wahiguru Chikakalsa, Shri Wahiguru Chikifate.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to welcome to Ottawa the Canadian Airports Council. CAC is the voice of more than 100 airports across Canada, and they work to ensure Canada is a leader in safe, high-quality, economically prosperous air transport. Serving as the gateways to the world, our airports generate nearly 200,000 jobs and contribute nearly $35 billion in GDP to our nation's economy. In my riding of Kelowna Lake Country, under the direction of Airport Manager Sam Samadar, Kelowna International Airport is one of the busiest airports in Canada, serving nearly 2 million people annually and contributing more than $800 million in total economic output to the province of British Columbia. I invite all members of this House to join the Canadian Airports Council tomorrow night at a reception from 5 to 7 at the Chateau Laurier to recognize our airport's contribution to our communities and the Canadian economy. If you have an airport in your riding, I'll see you tomorrow at the Chateau.
The Honourable Member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Mr. Speaker, today I stand in my Team Canada jersey, remembering the young men and women that lost their life in the horrific tragedy in Humboldt. As a parent, I know what it's like to send my children on a bus destined for camp or school or a sports tournament. This touches the lives of all Canadians. It's about the families and all of the lives that have been impacted and affected. It's about the people who welcome these young men into their home as billets. It's about hockey mums and dads. It's about the volunteers who do their best to keep our kids safe on trips away from home. Throughout the outpouring of support on Jersey Day and the hashtags Sticks Out for Humboldt and Humboldt Strong, I know that this has deeply touched individuals from across the country. On behalf of the residents of Elgin, Middlesex, London, we offer our sincere condolences to Humboldt and everyone affected. May God watch over you in the coming days.
Yeah.
Honourable Member for Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is a place that is filled with incredible and kind-hearted individuals whose deeds are done without acknowledgement and for the benefit of others. I'm proud to say that in my riding of Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge is home to many of these hidden heroes, like George Klassen and his late wife Shirley. They started their nonprofit organization, Project Wellness, in 2006, providing clean water, education, medicine, and food to orphans in Malawi. Last week, I was invited to George's 80th birthday, and words cannot express how inspiring it was to hear his experiences. Since 2006, George has built a total of 39 wells, has taken almost 500 orphans under his care, and continues to successfully drill clean water wells. In a week's time, at the young age of 80, he is leaving to drill the first of 5 new wells again in 2018. Good luck, George. You're an inspiration to me and our community. On behalf of all Parliament, we wish you safe travels, and maybe one day I'll be out there drilling a well beside you. Thank you.
L'Honorable Député d'Edmonton Centre.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Centre.
The economy must go hand in hand to ensure the long-term prosperity of all Canadians. With this in mind, and following rigorous reviews, our government approved the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Working with our Indigenous partners, we have completed in the deepest consultations with rights holders ever on a major project in this country. 43 First Nations have negotiated benefit agreements with the project, 33 of those in BC. Yet despite clear federal jurisdiction, repeated attempts have been made to undermine the project over the past months. We say enough is enough. As such, we've begun financial discussions with Kinder Morgan in order to remove the uncertainty surrounding this vital project. We are also pursuing legislative options that will assert the federal jurisdiction the courts have already told us we clearly have. Mr. Speaker, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project is in the national interest. It will be built.
L'Honorable Député de Louis.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, all Canadians will remember where they were when this happened. Today, all Canadians will remember where they were when the Broncos tragedy occurred. 16 young Canadians died in a road accident in Saskatchewan. These young people were part of the Humboldt Broncos team. Players, trainers, staff were among the victims. It is in these moments of tragedy that we are all Canadians. Whether they be families from my family or military personnel in Iraq or people here in the House of Commons, whether they be Muslims who in the greatest mosque in our country prayed for them, all Canadians have sympathy. Hockey isn't any other sport, Mr. Speaker. It's really important for us when people are on the ice. There's no language, race, religion. Today and always, We are Canadian, and we will all be Broncos. Thank you.
The honourable member for Brampton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This past Saturday, people of Sikh faith, both in Canada and around the world, celebrated Vaisakhi, marking the founding of Khalsa by Guru Gobind Singh Ji in 1699. During the celebration of prayer, reflection, and unity, our thoughts turn to the community. We are reminded of our ways our vibrant Sikh community plays to enrich our national fabric. All across Canada, Sikhs reaffirm the values of equality, social justice, and most importantly, selfless service. Each year, thousands of Sikh Canadians take part in self-service, also known as Seva, through free community kitchen, food drives, equality initiatives, and youth outreach programs. These programs, often run through local gurdwaras, such as Gurdwara Sikh Sangat in Brampton West, provide crucial support to their local communities. I applaud these programs for highlighting values that we share not only as Sikhs, but also as Canadians. To all those celebrating in Brampton West, across Canada, and around the world, happy Vaisakhi, Vaisakhi diyan lakh lakh vadaiyan. Thank you.
The honourable member for Ville-Marie, le Sud-Ouest, Île-des-Sœurs.
Bright orange hair, Rusty Staub was one of the original Montreal Expos, far and away their first star. Arriving in Montreal for the 1969 season, Staub helped establish the fledgling team and the professional sport of baseball in the hearts of Montrealers. Ce 29 mars, le jour d'ouverture de la saison.
March 29th, baseball's opening day, Le Grand Orange died, and baseball in Montreal lost one of its greatest figures. He was one of the best hitters, and he immersed himself in Quebec culture and even studied French in order to be able to talk to local media and his francophone admirers. Le Grand Orange has left an indelible memory in the heart of baseball lovers.
Final goodbye to Canada's first baseball superstar. Rest in peace, Rusty. There's some kids up there that need you.
Yeah. Honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Mr. Speaker, it's been 10 days and the collective soul of our nation is still coming to grips with the tragedy that took place at that rural Saskatchewan intersection involving the Humboldt Broncos hockey team. Despite the confusion, the anger, and the anguish over the past 10 days, Canadians have come together beautifully with an outpouring of love and support for those who perished, those who survived, and for their families. It's been incredible, Mr. Speaker, to see the compassion that Canadians have shown our neighbours in their time of pain. Tributes like Jersey Day, hockey sticks, athletic tape, and headsets placed on our porches, from Timbits Hockey to the National Hockey League and all levels in between. Canadians have wrapped Humboldt and the Broncos in our arms to mourn and to give comfort to those who need it. Hockey is Canada. Canada is hockey. Humboldt is Canada. Humboldt is hockey. This game, this beautiful game, will see the puck drop again in Humboldt, and when it does, all of Canada, and indeed all members of this House, will be cheering for Humboldt and our Broncos. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Vimy. Mr. Speaker, this week is National Volunteer Week, and I'm delighted to rise today to congratulate all those who have volunteered in their community. I would especially like to point out the work of Simone Langevin, who died March 27th, after having worked for 12 years as a volunteer in the Relais Communautaire de Laval. She was named Volunteer of the Year for 2017, and through her devotion, she made a difference in her community. She worked within groups where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and all society benefited. Thank you to all of those who invest themselves in their communities. These people are ready to give of their time, and they are absolutely precious to us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the NDP to mourn the loss of life in the horrific bus accident 10 days ago. we also pay tribute to the heroic work of Saskatchewan's first responders and extend condolences to everyone touched by this tragedy. Hockey brings people together as a touchstone of Canadian identity, nor more so than in Saskatchewan. While our province has been too small to support an NHL team, Saskatchewan has produced by far the most NHL players per capita of any province or state in the world. But the young people killed were not just great hockey players. They were pillars of the Humboldt community. They embodied a spirit of public service that inspires all Canadians and that we should strive to emulate here in this Parliament.
Honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Mr. Speaker, on April 6, Canada experienced a national tragedy after a collision in Saskatchewan claimed the lives of 16 people and forever changed the lives of many others. Sturgeon River Parkland's own Connor Lucan and Parker Tobin passed away in this terrible crash. Connor and Parker grew up in Sturgeon River Parkland, and they both played for the Humboldt Broncos. They are survived by their friends, family members, and teammates whose lives they touched. I would like to thank the first responders whose actions on the scene saved lives, and also the nurses and physicians who have spent countless hours attending to the needs of the victims and their families. You have the thanks of a grateful nation. To Lauren and Robin, Ed and Rhonda, no words that I say can ease the pain of your loss, but know that the people of Sturgeon River Parkland and our nation have your thoughts and prayers in their hearts. God bless.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Canso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As a former Junior A hockey coach and the father of a Quebec Major Junior League graduate, I can speak firsthand to the near sanctity of the team bus. Aspiring young Canadians spend days, weekends, even weeks on what serves as the team's rec room, their lunchroom, bedroom, and library. It's their sanctuary. But when the bus pulls out of the home rink parking lot, parents and billets alike think more in terms of, I hope the team gets a win and bring back some points. I know I can never recall thinking about, I hope they all make it back. That unspoken confidence in the team bus has been shattered, and the collective heart of a hockey nation has been broken. We mourn together. To the first responders who inherently and willingly accepted a high degree of danger and risk when they signed on to the job, we know they could never have imagined the horror and tragedy of that night. The Humboldt Broncos website posted, and I quote, "They woke up that morning with hopes of a winning game, but instead they united a nation," end quote. To the family and friends of all involved, know that our country shares your grief today and always.
As members of Parliament, we gather in this chamber to represent the people of Canada and to express their views and their wishes. Aujourd'hui, en leur nom, nous honorons la...
Today, in their name, we honor the memory of those who were hurt or those who lost their lives during the tragic accident that struck the Humboldt Broncos.
The Humboldt Broncos, I ask all members to rise in unity and observe a moment of silence.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, nearly 10 years ago, a government that was clearly hostile to pipelines took power in British Columbia. Since then, we have been urging the Prime Minister to take action, while the Trans Mountain Pipeline conflict has become a real crisis. But each time that the question of how to transport our resources comes up, this government only has one way of proceeding: delaying and obstructing. Why is the Prime Minister still waiting until it's the last minute to attend to these critical economic issues? Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
To speak as a Manitoban and as a prairie hockey dad, and to, on behalf of my family and all Manitobans, to offer our sincere condolences to the people of Humboldt and of Saskatchewan. This is a tragedy that we all feel personally in our families and in our communities. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was very clear yesterday on the government's position of ensuring that the pipeline be built. He offered ways in which the government intends to act. He has instructed the Minister of Finance to engage in financial discussions with Kinder Morgan. He is discussing with his government legislative ways to reassert federal jurisdiction. This pipeline will be built.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reason why the stakes are so high for Trans Mountain is because of this government's disastrous energy policy from start to finish. They vetoed Northern Gateway, something that had gone through an independent, evidence-based analysis. They killed Energy East. They've driven out $87 billion worth of investment in the energy sector. They've brought in Bill C-69, which has further shooken the confidence in Canada's economy. Why is it that the Trans Mountain project had to become a crisis before the Prime Minister finally took action?
Minister of Natural Resources. Approved the Line 3 replacement project. It's already underway. Construction in Alberta and Saskatchewan. There'll be further construction in the coming weeks in Manitoba. We are in support of the Keystone XL project. We have approved the TMX project. This will result in tens of thousands of jobs being created for Canadians. It will give us an opportunity to expand our export markets. As members know, 99% of the export of oil and gas in Canada goes to one country, the United States. At the same time, we're investing unprecedented investment.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, today in committee, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor completely debunked the conspiracy theory that the Indian government was behind the invitation of a convicted terrorist to the Prime Minister's event in India. Will the Prime Minister rise and repeat the false allegations that he made in this House on February 27th? And will he apologize to the Indian government?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure there will be further opportunities to respond to similar questions, since this is my first opportunity as a Member of Parliament from Saskatchewan. May I express my deep condolences to those who have suffered loss in the terrible tragedy that has befallen the Humboldt Broncos, and join with all of those in the House who are expressing prayers for the speedy recovery of all those who have been injured. The demonstration of solidarity in the House of Commons today is extremely important to the Premier and the province and all the people of Saskatchewan, a province that both the Leader of the Opposition and I share.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Minister for his sincere words, and I know I speak on behalf of all all members of the Conservative Party and all Canadians who have come together over this tragedy. I appreciate the nonpartisan sentiments that have brought us all together in tribute to the victims of the crash. Mr. Speaker, on February 27th, the Prime Minister advanced the theory that Jaspal Atwal's presence at a Government of Canada event in India was orchestrated by rogue elements within the Indian government. Today, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor said that the Prime Minister's theory is false. Will the Prime Minister stand and withdraw the false accusations he made on February 27th in this House and issue an apology to the Government of India?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, I note that the National Security Advisor was very clear in the remarks that he made today before the Standing Committee. I also note on numerous occasions when asked similar questions in this House, the Prime Minister has repeatedly said that he agrees with his National Security Advisor.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the information that has come out of the committee hearing today indicates that the government's theory that it was elements of the Indian government that were responsible for Mr. Atwal's presence was completely false, and that the theory being perpetrated was the responsibility of the Prime Minister's office. Did the Prime Minister approve the release of the false information about his India trip?
Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman seems to be following a misguided path here, because he says in one breath that he agrees and accepts the evidence that's been given by the National Security Advisor. That's good. That's exactly what the Prime Minister said.
The honourable member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-les-Basques. Mr. Speaker, at the end of his meeting with BC and Alberta yesterday, the Prime Minister said that he wanted to impose a solution on the provinces to try to deal with the Trans Mountain issue. Now, this solution would contravene the Environmental Act of one of these provinces. The Government of Quebec reminded Ottawa that for environmental projects happening in a particular province, that needs to be subject to provincial environmental laws. So where is the cooperative federalism promised by the Prime Minister? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of our cooperation, our federalist cooperation with the provinces, and we always have been. This project is in the national interest. That is why we will be moving forward with this project. The federal government has jurisdiction over this type of project. Let us be clear, the Supreme Court has already stated this. We know it, and we know that it's in the national interest. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-les-Basques.
Approved the Trans Mountain project, relying on the environmental assessment process of the Harper government, which they used to denounce. They now use it because it suits them. Ramming a project down the province's throat is not cooperative federalism. Yesterday, the Prime Minister said he will pursue legislative options to reinforce the federal jurisdiction regarding energy projects, which he said, and I quote, we know we clearly have. But, Mr. Speaker, it's not clear. Will the government partner with BC, First Nations, and Alberta to seek greater clarity from the Supreme Court of Canada?
Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the Trans Mountain Expansion project was approved by the British Columbia government, and there was an environmental assessment process in British Columbia that led to the approval. Second of all, we did not use the same rules as the Harper administration. We used different ones, which led to incredible consultation, historic consultation with Indigenous peoples up and down the line. And after months of consultation and tens of thousands of conversations, we approved this in Canada's interests.
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay. Order.
Mr. Speaker, the ultimatum over the Kinder Morgan pipeline will not be solved by jumping to the deadline of a Texas oil company, because the issue of social license for Indigenous Canadians remains unresolved. And yet, if you look at the minister's own briefing notes, the government admits that their response to the legitimate Indigenous questions are, quote, paternalistic, unrealistic, and inadequate. That's colonialism 101. Did the Prime Minister really think he was going to stop the Kinder Morgan impasse by deliberately excluding Indigenous leadership from Alberta and British Columbia from the talks?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member knows, major projects such as this are by their very nature controversial, and they divide communities. I mean, there are many people in British Columbia who think this is a very important project for Canada. As a matter of fact, it even divides political parties. Perhaps the member would want to organize a meeting with the NDP premiers of Alberta and British Columbia and see what kind of consensus he can arrange.
For Timmins James Bay.
Refer him to his notes about being paternalistic and inadequate, because I'm very pleased that the Premier of British Columbia and Alberta are at the table. The question is why they're deliberately excluding Indigenous Canadians.
Hear, hear.
That's the question. They're asking Canadians to assume the financial risk for Kinder Morgan, but there's also a significant social risk. So I want to ask my friend, just how far are they willing to go to run roughshod over Indigenous rights to do the work of a Texas-based oil company? Answer that.
The Honourable Minister. The member for Lakeland. Oh, sorry.
Mr. Speaker, on April...
Sorry. Pardon me. I thought the minister... The Honourable Order. I need a whistle, I think. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Order.
Time to my honourable friend. But before I do, the member knows that the Government of Canada has engaged in unprecedented consultation with Indigenous communities up and down the line. We know that 44 Indigenous communities have signed benefit agreements with Kinder Morgan, 33 of them in British Columbia. Others have been involved with us in establishing a monitoring committee, co-developed between the government and Indigenous communities for the first time in Canadian history.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, on April 6th in BC, the Prime Minister claimed Trans Mountain will be safe, jobs will be created, it will be built. 48 hours later, Kinder Morgan said it won't if roadblocks aren't gone by May 31st. On April 9th, the Canadian Pipeline Association said the energy sector is in crisis mode. That same day, the Natural Resources Minister said it's not a crisis. Ministers met urgently, spouted empty words, ran away. The PM took a day off while the Finance Minister met the Alberta Premier, then went to Peru. Yesterday, he met with both premiers for the first time and announced nothing. He's failed. Nothing. When will the Trans Mountain expansion be built?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition, in front of a national audience, decided to speak before the Premier of Alberta and before the Prime Minister of Canada. He has powers of intuition beyond the normal. He was able to intuit exactly what the Premier and the Prime Minister were going to say so well that he spoke before they did. Well, we're looking for the Leader of the Opposition's vision of the energy future for Canada, not seeking to speak.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland. Sorry.
Mr. Speaker, at least my leader didn't run away from the media. It tells the world Canada is closed for business, destroys competitiveness, and risks the future. It's the latest in a pattern of capital fleeing Canada under this Prime Minister, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds of thousands of jobs in all sectors, billions for the economy, for social programs for all, hundreds of millions for more than 40 First Nations, and national unity are at risk. It's been a year and a half since the Prime Minister said it's in the national interest. When will Trans Mountain be built?
Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable friend says running away from the media. Last week, Country 93.3 in Fort McMurray, the Globe and Mail, CBC Radio Vancouver, 660 News in Calgary, the Calgary Herald, Bloomberg Media, CBC Radio Alberta, the Toronto Star, 77 News in Calgary, the Canadian Press, Radio Canada in Edmonton, the Dale Oily Bulletin, Le Devoir, Global News, CKNW Vancouver, Global News TV in Edmonton. I had ample opportunity to talk about the government's position to the media and to the country.
Order. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Prime Minister and his government hate Canadian oil. That is the reality. Let's remember, in January 2017 in Calgary, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, we need to phase out oil sands in Alberta. That is unacceptable for the Prime Minister of Canada to say that. But today he says, oh, don't worry, the pipelines in the West will work. But it won't, because he's not being honest. So will the Prime Minister recognize that he doesn't believe in Albertan oil? The Honourable Minister of Transport. He said many times, Mr. Speaker, that this project is in the national interest. It can't be much more clear than that. That's why we are going to move forward with the project, and that's why we will ensure that the pipeline is built. We are talking to our partners, and I can tell you that the Conservatives under Harper spent 10 years getting absolutely nothing done on this file. They didn't even start discussions with Indigenous persons. They didn't develop any environmental strategy. We believe in development, but we also believe in protecting the environment. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, the Minister should agree with me. This is a serious issue, much more serious than the Nordique of Quebec. Now, unfortunately, since this government has been in power, we've just seen failure after failure. For Energy East, due to Liberal policies, the project was put aside. And currently, with Trans Mountain, we don't even know what the final outcome will be. Is the Minister aware that when his leader says that we need to phase out Albertan oil, that is a very bad signal that we're sending not only to Canadians, but to everyone in the world? Honourable Minister of Transport. I'll say it again, Mr. Speaker. Our government will move forward with this project. It is in the national interest. It is important for our country. It is important not only for Alberta, but for Canada as a whole. However, the Conservatives under Harper didn't manage to get anything done for the 10 years that they were in power. We will move forward with this file. It's not a question of if, but when. We are working with our partners to ensure that we will move forward with this project, which is so important for Canada.
Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, 9 weeks ago when talking about the Trans Mountain Pipeline and our motion which would be supporting it, the Natural Resources Minister said there's simply no need for a motion today that attempts to manufacture a crisis where one does not exist.
Wow.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there is a crisis, and if that minister had spent half the time recognizing the crisis that's going on in the energy sector as he does compiling the lists of interviews that he clearly spent a whole bunch of time doing, he would know that this is a crisis not only on pipelines, but jobs, and it's their abdication of responsibility to the energy sector that has caused this, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't talk to the press enough. I talk to the press too much. All the time, we look at ways of emboldening and enhancing the oil and gas sector and the future of the energy sector in Canada. As a matter of fact, it was only a week ago when the Prime Minister and I were in Fort McMurray, talking to workers, talking to CEOs within the energy sector, understanding the importance of certainty for investment, the importance of investment in the sector internationally, that Canada is a place where people can have confidence, and that is why we are determined to see that this project in the national interest will be built.
The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
We've been warning the Liberal government that their policies are hurting Canada's energy sector, killing competitiveness and jobs. Their carbon tax, their tanker ban, their disastrous approval process has killed projects like Petronas LNG, Northern Gateway, Energy East, and now we see Trans Mountain dying a slow death. Investment and jobs are leaving Canada as we speak. When will they get their heads out of the sand and realize that their policies are disastrous for Canada's energy sector?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Pipelines, job creation for the people of Alberta, for the people of Western Canada, compared to the 10-year record of the Harper Conservative government, not 1 kilometre of pipeline built to Tidewater, no consultation with Indigenous people, court cases who said that the Harper government had failed in its constitutional responsibilities, no conversation with the importance of energy and the environment being part of one conversation. Mr. Speaker, why would we want to mimic that record of failure?
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
In 2015, in BC, the Prime Minister said it's essential for social license for any project like the Kinder Morgan pipeline. When he okayed Kinder Morgan using Harper's deeply flawed process and over the objections of cities and First Nations, he went back on his word. He also promised provinces a cooperative relationship, but instead is pushing Kinder Morgan through in spite of the alarm raised by BC over oil tanker traffic increases and increased oil spill risk. Why did the Liberal government break its promise?
Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, the member talks about the same process that was used by the Harper government, and as I said a moment ago, we changed the process. We added layers of consultation with Indigenous peoples because the Federal Court of Appeal said that the Harper government didn't consult enough. We sent an expert panel that went up and down the line. There are now 44 Indigenous communities who will benefit, 33 of them in British Columbia. We know that projects like this don't achieve consensus everywhere. We do know that this is in the national interest.
Honourable member for Stina-Bulkley Valley.
Last year, the people of British Columbia elected a government truly committed to protecting our coast. More than 2 years ago, this Liberal government promised to completely redo Stephen Harper's failed assessment of the Kinder Morgan pipeline project. Yet because Liberals broke that promise, the people of BC have taken to the streets and to the courts to defend our beautiful coast and our legal rights. But it isn't just the Prime Minister who's betraying that commitment. Every single Liberal MP elected from BC broke that promise too. So my question is simple. Is there just one BC Liberal MP who has the courage to stand up to this Prime Minister? Is there just one who will stand with British Columbians?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite forgot to mention the $1.5 billion Ocean Protection Plan. He didn't mention it because, for whatever reason, he's not prepared to admit that this government has established and will establish a world-class system to protect our coasts. Why is that not part of the conversation? A coast that this member in his riding knows all too well is essential not only to British Columbians, but to all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Mr. Speaker, for months now, we have been demanding that the Prime Minister take action to get Trans Mountain built. But all we've gotten is slogans and platitudes. This crisis is more about than a pipeline. It's about the confidence job-creating businesses have in Canada. This crisis will take more than just a layover on his way to Paris to get the problem solved. So, Speaker, to the Minister, when will it get built?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
The government is committed to having the pipeline built. We have intervened in motions at the National Energy Board when there were attempts to unnecessarily delay the project. We happen to be successful in that motion. We will be continually alert to attempts to delay because we know that delay adds to uncertainty. Uncertainty adds to costs. What the Prime Minister said yesterday is that we will not tolerate unnecessary delays and we will add certainty.
Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, the Prime Minister continues to demonstrate that he either doesn't want this Trans Mountain pipeline to be built or really doesn't care if it even proceeds. Instead, he continues to make matters worse by imposing policies that harm the Canadian energy sector, like the carbon tax and new regulations that penalize Canadian oil exports. The failure of this Prime Minister to take leadership has caused this crisis. So, Speaker, when will the Liberals finally take this crisis seriously?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I just don't understand where the preamble comes from. You know, members opposite talk about just words. Well, if they were tuning in to what the Prime Minister said yesterday, or maybe they're tuned off after the Leader of the Opposition was finished, not waiting for the Premier of Alberta, not waiting for the Prime Minister of Canada, he would have heard not only words, but commitment in significant and substantial ways, because this pipeline will be built.
The honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, it has been 5 months since the Prime Minister approved the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but Kinder Morgan is still unable to get their shovels into the ground. The Prime Minister has failed to show the leadership required to solve an interprovincial dispute. The blame for this project failing to move forward falls squarely at his feet. When will the Prime Minister stop promising this pipeline and start delivering it?
That's right.
Honourable Minister.
Actually, it wasn't 5 months ago, Mr. Speaker, when the pipeline was approved. It was well more than a year ago. And ever since the pipeline was approved, the Prime Minister, in his speeches, regardless of where they're delivered, in Nanaimo, in Vancouver, in Edmonton, in Fort McMurray, in Calgary, in Winnipeg, in St. John's, Newfoundland, in Fredericton, has the same message. And the message is that we have the capacity and the commitment in this government to make sure that we are stewards of the environment, that we are creating good jobs for the energy sector in Canada.
Honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he wants Trans Mountain Pipeline built, but like every promise he makes, it's all talk and no action. Let's be clear. Since this government has taken power, 125,000 jobs have been lost in the Canadian oil patch. That's devastating on local communities and families. We're 6 weeks away from losing this project and all the jobs that go with it. When will the pipeline be built?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
The member quotes 125,000 jobs lost. He doesn't quote that half of them have been regained. So, as often is the case in having a discussion with members opposite, we don't get the full picture. For example, how often do we hear them talk about the jobs that have been created by approving Line 3? How many times do we hear them talking about the pipelines that we've approved in Northern Alberta? Why don't they talk about this government's commitment to work with the private sector to make sure that Canada is at the leading edge of using the resources we have in the...
Honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is now promising to remove the uncertainty around the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Yet 28 months into their mandate, they've yet to deliver their promised strengthened environmental and project review laws. Industry, legal experts, and Indigenous leaders alike all agree this fast-tracked omnibus bill will create even greater uncertainty and fails to make significant reforms. Will this government finally agree to divide this bill and enable constructive dialogue and deliver the promised strengthened environmental and energy laws?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, our government has brought forward in Bill C-69 better rules for the review of major projects that will protect our environment, fish and waterways, will restore public trust and respect Indigenous rights, and will strengthen our economy and encourage investment. Reforms to these laws were important because of the gutting of environmental assessment procedures that were undertaken in 2012 under the previous Conservative government. We are committed to changing the way decisions on projects are made so that they are guided by science, evidence, and Indigenous traditional knowledge.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie.
Morgan. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, follow me because it's complicated to understand the literal object. On the one hand, they're talking about a new system for environmental assessment that's supposed to restore public confidence, but at the same time, it's impossible to understand which project it'll apply to. If nothing's assessed, well, it won't serve a purpose. And the Minister of the Environment is giving free passes to very polluting projects. So what purpose does it serve to have an EA process if the projects are dangerous to our environment and the ones that are dangerous, and they won't even be assessed?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The environment and the economy go hand in hand. We have put forth better regulations that will protect the environment, restore public confidence, and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. This will result in a project-based approach, a clearer process, and more effective process.
Mr. Speaker, as the chair of the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, I was proud to table our committee study on Canada's seniors, tabled in the House a few weeks ago. Our government has shown that it is committed to improving income security and promoting social inclusion for seniors. Could the minister responsible for seniors tell this House what the next steps are for Canadian seniors?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would first like to thank the member from Cambridge, as well as all members of the UMA committee, for their outstanding work on behalf of seniors. I would also like to thank the member from Nickel Belt for tabling the motion that led to this report, as well as all members of the Liberal Caucus on Seniors. I would also, Mr. Speaker, say that we are looking forward to working with the National Seniors Council to review and respond to the important work of the committee. Thank you.
The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, on February 22nd, the Prime Minister told Canadians that the Atwal invitation to India came from one of his members. Then, February 27th, he said loudly and clearly that it was a conspiracy by rogue elements in the Indian government. Today, the National Security Advisor, Mr. Jean, revealed that he had never specified the government of India in his briefing. So will the Prime Minister do the right thing and retract his statement?
Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has always supported his national security advisor, but whether by accident or by design, the opposition continues to pursue a faulty and misleading line of argument. Mr. Speaker, to provide the opposition with full information, both classified and unclassified, an offer has been outstanding for more than 3 weeks now to provide that full briefing to the Leader of the Opposition. When will that briefing be scheduled by the Leader of the Opposition?
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, I think that this morning's briefing was clear. But despite that, despite the evidence from the National Security Advisor, Canadians don't know the truth about the Atwal affair. Mr. Jean denies that the conspiracy was by rogue elements of the Indian government. That's what he said this morning. Now, India is an important country for us when it comes to exports, and it's fragile. When will the Prime Minister show some leadership and apologize to the Indian government?
Mr. Speaker, the speculation about some so-called conspiracy theory largely came from the opposition. That is the problem, Mr. Speaker, when you're operating on misinformation and disinformation and a willful ignorance of the facts. The offer has been made to provide the opposition with the full classified briefing, and so far they have refused to schedule that meeting. They should schedule the meeting so the Leader of the Opposition can be fully briefed.
Honourable Member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, on February 22nd in India, the Prime Minister acknowledged that one of his MPs invited Jaspal Atwal to his events. On February 27th, in this place, the Prime Minister acknowledged claims by his security advisor that the Indian government conspiracy was a possible route to the invitation as well. Today, the minister is suggesting it's us making this claim, Mr. Speaker, when he in this House refused to talk about classified information. So if an invitation from his own MP is classified, why do we need a special investigation if it's all not classified?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable gentleman fails to understand the difference between classified and unclassified information, he is in desperate need of a briefing to explain the distinction. The offer has been made to the Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition should accept that invitation, and maybe the Leader of the Opposition would then avoid headlines like "Conservatives duped by false story."
Honourable Member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, today the minister has suggested the opposition's on a misguided path. Well, the tour guide on that misguided path is the Prime Minister and this minister, Mr. Speaker. I would put it back at him. If a Liberal MP invited Mr. Atwal, a convicted terrorist, to the Prime Minister's events, and they cancelled that, and that's the only possible explanation for the India scandal, why do we need a classified briefing?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, maybe the obvious fact is, Mr. Speaker, that the Leader of the Opposition and the Opposition generally is not fully informed of all of the facts that they need to know to fully understand the situation and indeed to avoid mistakes like they made last week in getting sucked into a totally false story.
Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Saanich, Sooke.
Mr. Speaker, while the repeated use of chemical weapons by Syrian government forces is unquestionably a war crime, the airstrikes last week were not only contrary to international law, but similar strikes last year failed to end the use of chemical weapons on Syrian civilians. The government has clearly expressed their support for these airstrikes, but there's no evidence of any plan for what's next or any diplomatic efforts to try and end this crisis. Mr. Speaker, where's Canada in pushing for an international solution to the Syrian crisis?
The Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we have been clear in our condemnation of the use of chemical weapons against people in eastern Ghouta, and we've been working hard with international allies to pursue accountability for what are war crimes. This includes $9 million for the verification, investigation, and fact-finding activities of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the UN, and we are also providing over $290 million to support NGOs, UN partners, and the Red Cross to deliver life-saving assistance in Syria. Mr. Speaker, the murderous Assad regime must end the deliberate targeting of civilians.
The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. It's not just chemical weapons that are being used by Assad against civilians, against his own people, Mr. Speaker. There are attacks, other attacks, forced disappearances, torture, famine as a tactic for war, and I've just listed a few. Will the government contribute to diplomatic efforts to put an end to this horrible suffering by the Syrian people? Take the authors of these crimes to hold them to account and increase humanitarian assistance. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we are clear in our condemnation of the use of chemical weapons in eastern Ghouta, as well as all violence against Syrians. Canada continues to work with its international allies to hold the authors of these crimes accountable. That includes $9 million for verification, investigation, and fact-finding missions, among others. Let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, that the murderous Assad regime must put an end to this deliberate targeting of its own people. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-Les Halles. Mr. Speaker, this is a National Grain Producers Week, and many producers will be in Ottawa this week. And the crisis when it comes to transporting grains is going to be on the agenda. And the Prime Minister and the Minister of Agriculture, through their lack of action, have cost producers and the economy millions in losses. This government's trademark is waiting for things to resolve themselves. Canada's reputation has been tarnished when it comes to grain exports. Can the Minister of Agriculture inform the House of the government's intentions when it comes to the proposed amendments by the Senate to Bill C-49?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The Honourable Minister of Transport. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as you know, I've written to the two grain companies to accelerate the issue. There has been a great deal of progress since then. We will continue to work on that. When it comes to the proposed amendments from the Senate on Bill C-49, we have received them. We are taking a close and careful look at them, and we will very shortly present our position on that. I hope that the Conservatives will support us so that we can get this bill through Parliament as quickly as possible.
President, Liberals have said again and again that Bill C-49 will resolve the rail backlog. They refuse to divide Bill C-49. They refuse to use a Northern Council to force the railway companies to move our farmers' grain to market. And the Ag Minister finally unveiled the truth in Winnipeg recently. Quote, if Bill C-49 passes, it won't solve the issue right away. How will you respond to the amendment on Bill C-49? Would it be another refusal to act for farmers?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, we care very deeply about the movement of grain in this country. It's an extremely important commodity, and I have written with the Agriculture Minister to the railways to get them to increase the flow of grain to our ports, and they are certainly doing that as well. And I've also spoken to them about the 90% of the other commodities that they carry that are so important for Canadians: forestry products, potash, containers, coal, minerals, and all of those other products as well.
Honourable Member for Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, the minister's corrupt surf clam decision had nothing to do with reconciliation.
but rather it has all to do with blatantly lining the pockets of Liberal families, Liberal family insiders. The Newfoundland and Labrador Premier was in Ottawa late last week and raising serious questions about job losses, economic impact, and this corrupt bid process. Can the Prime Minister please explain why lining the pockets of Liberal family members and Liberal insiders is more important than the families of Grand Bank?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have increased the participation of Indigenous peoples in the fishery is part of our commitment. Improving relations, and as you know, it comes from this is an important stage in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, Mr. Speaker. I know that it's difficult for the former government to admit, but they completely forgot about First Nations in this public process, Mr. Speaker. And what we have done is put Indigenous peoples in the forefront, and we will ensure that this resource is available to all Canadians.
Terry Whiterock.
Mr. Speaker, as a former youth probation officer, Little League football and basketball coach, I've seen the amazing power of sport to change lives. Following the incredible successes of Canadians at the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games and now at the Commonwealth Games in Australia, could the Minister of Sport and Persons with Disabilities please, like Rusty Staub, knock this softball out of the park? What is the importance of these games for Canadians?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you to the member for South Surrey Whiterock for an important question. Our athletes' tremendous achievements at the Gold Coast 2018 Commonwealth Games are a source of pride for Canada and reflect the strength of our sports system. Les Jeux du Commonwealth.
The Commonwealth Games lead to the Olympics and the Paralympic Games.
Of our athletes for their podium and personal best successes. They're bringing home 82 medals, and they are an inspiration for all Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Medicine Hat, Cardston Warner.
Mr. Speaker, this weekend, armed rebel factions conducted 2 coordinated attacks against UN bases in Mali. It comes a week after 2 peacekeepers were killed in Mali. These are targeted attacks by a variety of terror groups operating with impunity in Mali, and increasingly, UN peacekeepers are the target. Will the Liberal government finally admit that the Mali mission is not a peacekeeping mission, and will they bring this deployment to this House for a debate and a vote?
Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, regardless of where our Canadian Armed Forces personnel serve, whether it's in Iraq or on UN peacekeeping missions, we're going to make sure that they have the appropriate mandate, the appropriate equipment, Mr. Speaker, and more importantly, the right rules of engagement that will be set out by the Chief of Defence Staff to making sure that they have the right of self-defence and, more importantly, for the protection of civilians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, last Tuesday, a fire broke out on the Catherine Spirit. 75 firefighters were mobilized to deal with it. The firefighters saw a black plume of smoke and are so concerned because they wonder what they inhaled. I have questions. Were contaminants removed from the vessel? What caused the fire? What will the consequences be? This work should be done in a safe manner. Will the government conduct an investigation to shed light on this fire on the Catherine Spirit? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, our government acknowledges the risks relating to abandoned vessels for the environment. A small fire broke out in the machine room on the Catherine Spirit during a work that was taking place on April 10th. No one was injured, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to reiterate no injuries took place. The Coast Guard was in constant communication with officials on the Catherine Spirit, and we will continue to do so. We will monitor the vessel to ensure that the local community is taken into account and the issue is resolved once and for all. The Honourable Member for Saint-Léonard Saint-Michel. Mr. Speaker, many Canadians, like the residents of my riding, are busy doing their taxes, and this will give them access to important credits and benefits that our government has put in place, such as the Canada Child Benefit and the Canadian Caregiver Tax Credit. We know that this year our government has improved services to tax filers. Can the Minister of National Revenue inform this House of the important changes put in place to make it easier for Canadians to file their taxes electronically? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I would like to thank my colleague from St. Leonard, St. Michel for his important question. Improving services at the agency is our top priority. We have done so for nearly 90% of Canadians who choose to file online with services such as autofill, my return, and net files. The Express Notice of Assessment service lets Canadians using certified tax software receive and print their notice of assessment immediately after filing. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind all members and Canadians in this House to file their tax returns by April 30th to ensure that they access the benefits to which they're entitled. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, the Assad regime has repeatedly used chemical weapons against its own people, and our allies have struck to try and take this capability away. But next month, despite being one of the world's worst offenders of international law regarding the possession and use of illegal weapons, Syria will chair the UN Conference on Disarmament. There could be no equivocating about whether or not this is acceptable, and Canada has boycotted this conference in the past when it was chaired by other rogue states. So will the government condemn this appointment and boycott this meeting?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, my colleague across the way knows how strongly this government condemns the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime on people in eastern Ghouta. We've supported the decision by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France to take action to degrade the Assad regime's ability to launch chemical weapons attack against its own people, and we continue to work closely with our allies in the international community on this and many other issues that concern the Syrian regime and security for the people of Syria. We're providing vital support to the fact-finding mission in Syria and humanitarian efforts. We condemn the Assad regime and its backers, Russia and Iran, for repeated violation of human rights.
L'honorable député de Rivière-du-Nord.
The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister had the very bad idea to resolve the spat between BC and Alberta. As a result, social acceptability, Aboriginal rights, the province's right to determine what happens in its jurisdiction is all going out the window, and henceforth Ottawa will be making decisions on its own. This signals an end to the Prime Minister's cooperative federalism. It's back to Ottawa knows best. BC doesn't want Kinder Morgan any more than Quebec wanted Energy East. Is it that difficult to understand?
The Minister of Transport.
The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to mention that the relationship between our federal government and the province of Quebec has always been of the utmost, very respectful. We understand the importance of respecting jurisdictions which are provincial, and that's what we've done since the outset. Let me be clear. The decision regarding the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline is under federal jurisdiction. It's a matter of determining who is responsible for which issue. And in passing, I'd like to congratulate my colleague for his beautiful shirt today.
Député de Rivière-du-Nord.
Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. We're talking about respect. If Quebec establishes legislation to protect its environment or develop its land, Ottawa can come through, ignore it. These laws adopted by our elected officials, all in the interest of the national interest? No, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Quebec, having a pipeline imposed in the name of the national interest is simply out of the question. That's why we support BC. Since when does national interest mean taking action that's not in the interest of Quebec, the provinces? We're talking about respect here. The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to quote Premier Couillard, who says our Alberta counterparts are aware of the importance of making their resources available to the country. It's as if we were told that we couldn't export our hydroelectricity. I wouldn't be very happy. We have to understand that fact. In the government, we do understand the way Alberta feels on this.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition is rising on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. During question period, the Minister of Natural Resources misled the House by indicating that the previous Conservative government was not able to complete any pipelines. I'd like to seek unanimous consent to table the list of the 4 major pipelines that were built under the previous Conservative government, including the approval of Northern Gateway, a pipeline to Tidewater.
That's the honourable order. I have to hear the answer and I have to ask the question. Members come to order. Does the honourable member have, the honourable leader of the opposition have the unanimous consent of the House? No, there is no unanimous consent. Tabling of documents.